The history of the Mexica people takes its origin in the spectral realm between myth and history, in a place called Aztlan, whose name later gave rise to the term Aztec. According to the codices and oral traditions preserved by indigenous chroniclers, Aztlan was an island paradise somewhere in the northwest of Mexico, possibly in the modern states of Nayarit or Sinaloa. Archaeological data suggest that this ancestral homeland could have been located near lagoons or marshy areas, as throughout their history the Mexica maintained a deep understanding of lacustrine agriculture and water management systems, which could only have been developed over many generations of practice. The divine mandates that forced the Mexica to leave their ancestral home came through their patron god Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun in the form of a hummingbird. According to the creation narrative recorded in sources such as the Codex Orbin and the Chronicles of Fernando Alvarado, Huitzilopochtli appeared to the tribal priests and ordered them to leave Aztlan. The god promised to lead them to a new homeland, where they would become rulers of all they saw. But first, they had to survive a period of wandering that would test their faith and transform them into a people worthy of greatness. This divine prophecy laid the religious foundation for what became one of the most significant migrations in history, as the Mexica understood their journey not merely as a search for better lands, but as a sacred crusade ordained by their gods. The migration began somewhere in the 12th century AD, most likely around 1111 or 1168. According to various chronological interpretations of the sources, the Mexica left Aztlan as one of several Nahuatl-speaking groups known collectively as Chichimeca, who were moving out of the northern regions of Mesoamerica during this period. Climate change, demographic pressure, and political upheaval in the north likely contributed to these mass movements, although the Mexica themselves emphasized the religious imperative above all other factors. Their path south lay through the rugged terrain of western Mexico, following ancient trade routes that connected the northern frontier with the civilized center of central Mexico. The migrating group consisted of several hundred people organized into Calpulli kinship alliances that served as the basic building blocks of Mexica society. Each Calpulli maintained its identity and leadership while recognizing the collective authority of the tribal council and the priests who carried the sacred bundle. With the image of Huitzilopochtli, the Mexica migration was not a direct march, but represented a series of temporary settlements, interspersed with periods of movement. They established camps for months or even years in places providing sufficient resources, especially water and arable land. During these stops, they practiced their traditional combination of hunting, gathering, and small-scale farming, growing maize, beans, and squash wherever conditions permitted. The portable nature of their material culture during this period reflects their nomadic lifestyle. They carried with them only a few things beyond essential tools, weapons, and religious artifacts. As the Mexica advanced deep into central Mexico, they encountered increasingly complex civilizations. The Valley of Mexico, in the 13th and 14th centuries, was under the rule of several powerful city-states, including Culhuac, Azcapotzalco, Chalco, Texcoco, and Xochimilco. These urban centers controlled vast territories and enjoyed the loyalty of numerous smaller settlements. The population of the valley was ethnically diverse. The majority were Nahuatl speakers, but significant communities of Otomi, Tepanec, and other groups maintained their distinctiveness. The established authorities initially viewed the Mexica as just another group of barbarian Chichimecs from the north. The term Chichimeca, meaning dog people, was used by the sedentary population somewhat dismissively to describe semi-nomadic groups, periodically entering the valley. However, the Mexica possessed certain advantages that distinguished them from other migrants. They were skilled warriors, having honed their military abilities during the long journey through hostile territory. They also demonstrated remarkable adaptability, quickly learning the political dynamics of the valley and positioning themselves as valuable allies, rather than mere plunderers. The city-state of Culhuac became the first significant patron of the Mexica in the valley. Culhuacan claimed direct descent from the ancient Toltecs and maintained significant prestige. Despite a decline in military power, the rulers of Culhuacan recognized the combat prowess of the Mexica and hired them as mercenaries. In their conflicts with neighboring city-states, this agreement provided the Mexica with their first stable base in the valley, allowing them to gain deep knowledge of local warfare, politics, and culture. During their service to Culhuacan, the Mexica demonstrated their effectiveness in several military campaigns. They fought against the people of Texcoco, inhabitants of the Chimpas, floating gardens in the southern part of the lake, and proved their ability to adapt combat techniques to the unique environment of the valley's lake system. The Mexica warriors learned to use canoes effectively in battle and developed tactics for fighting in the marshy terrain surrounding the lakes. The relationship between the Mexica and Culhuacan eventually soured due to cultural and political friction. The Mexica adhered to religious practices that the more refined inhabitants of Culhuacan considered barbarian, including forms of human sacrifice that went even beyond the norms of Mesoamerican ritual violence. Furthermore, the growing confidence and assertiveness of the Mexica began to worry their patrons, who realized that their mercenaries might in time become rivals rather than subordinates. After leaving Culhuacan, the Mexica sought work with Azcapotzalco, the most powerful city-state in the Western Valley. The Tepanec rulers of Azcapotzalco controlled vast networks of tribute and commanded the largest armed forces in the region. They welcomed the auxiliary troops of the Mexica, especially valuing their skills in long-distance warfare and their willingness to perform dangerous missions that hereditary warriors might avoid. Under the patronage of the Tepanecs, the Mexica participated in campaigns throughout the valley and beyond. They fought against the city-state of Texcoco on the other side of the lake, helped suppress rebellions in dependent communities, and served as shock troops in major battles. This military experience provided the Mexica with comprehensive knowledge of the geography, resources, and political weaknesses of the valley. They learned which communities were flourishing, which trade routes were most valuable, and which alliances were fragile enough to be exploited. The reputation of the Mexica as fierce warriors grew during this period, but they remained fundamentally dependent on their patrons for land and resources. They lived in settlements on the fringes of established territories, always at risk of being expelled if their services were no longer required. This unstable situation forced their leaders to seek a permanent homeland, where they could found their own city-state and govern their destiny. The divine sign that ended their wanderings appeared in the form of a vision, fulfilling the ancient prophecy of Huitzilopochtli. According to Mexica tradition, their priests received a revelation directing them to seek a specific place, where they would see an eagle perched on a nopal cactus devouring a snake. This image, which later became the central symbol of Mexican national identity, embodied the cosmic balance between opposing forces and the triumph of the solar deity over the forces of the earth. The search for this prophetic sign led the Mexica to the marshy islands and reed beds of Lake Texcoco in the heart of the valley. The shores of the lake system were already densely populated, but the small islands and marshy areas in the interior remained practically unused by the established city-states. These wetlands were considered low-value lands, suitable only for hunting waterfowl or gathering reeds, but hardly the foundation for a major settlement. When Mexica scouts finally discovered the prophetic eagle on a small island in the lake, the practical problems of creating a settlement there must have seemed insurmountable. The island barely rose above the water level in the rainy season, lacked sources of fresh water, and had no natural building materials except mud and reeds. However, the religious significance of the place outweighed all practical considerations. The priests declared that Huitzilopochtli had chosen this place as the center of their future empire, and the people unhesitatingly accepted this divine decision. The initial settlement on the island was extremely modest. The first structures were simple huts erected on raised platforms for protection against seasonal floods. The Mexica built these early buildings using techniques learned during their nomadic period, weaving walls from reeds and covering them with mud plaster. Roofs were covered with lake grass, and floors were made of packed earth mixed with crushed shells and pottery shards to provide drainage. Fresh water presented an immediate and constant problem. The lake water was brackish and undrinkable, forcing the settlers to develop original solutions. They dug shallow wells that reached underground freshwater sources, and built complex systems of canals and reservoirs to collect and store rainwater. Water management became a central task that later turned into the sophisticated hydraulic engineering for which the Aztec capital would be famous. The production of food on the island required the development of entirely new agricultural technologies. The Mexica could not simply transfer their traditional farming methods to this aquatic environment. Instead, they began to experiment with Chinampas artificial islands created by piling mud, lake sediment, and organic matter onto shallow areas of the lake. These floating gardens, anchored by willow trees whose roots grew into the lake bottom, provided highly fertile areas for growing crops. Early Chinampas were small and primitive compared to the complex systems that would later surround the Aztec capital. The first settlers learned through trial and error which crops grew best in the unique conditions of the lake environment, how to manage water levels to prevent floods or droughts, and how to maintain the structural integrity of their artificial islands against constant erosion by wind and waves. The transition of the Mexica from nomadic mercenaries to sedentary farmers was neither smooth nor instantaneous. Many aspects of their traditional culture had to be adapted or completely discarded. The portable material culture of the years of wandering gave way to more substantial possessions, reflecting their permanent settlement. They began to produce larger quantities of ceramics, developing new styles reflecting their unique environment and experience. The social organization of the community also evolved during this period. The Calpulli system, which had served them well during the migration, was modified to account for the realities of sedentary life. Each kinship group was allocated specific areas of the island for residence, and assigned responsibility for certain aspects of public life, such as maintaining sections of the Chinampa system, organizing religious ceremonies, or providing warriors for the protection of the community. The first decades of settlement were marked by a constant struggle for survival and recognition. The established authorities of the valley initially viewed the Mexico Island community as an insignificant curiosity, barely worthy of their attention. This neglect was in many ways advantageous, as it allowed the Mexica to develop their unique adaptation to the lake environment without interference from more powerful neighbors. However, isolation also meant vulnerability. The Mexica had to develop their own defensive capabilities. Without the protection of a powerful patron, they built fortifications around their settlement, using the natural barriers of the lake to their advantage and erecting artificial defenses to protect against attacks from the water. The warriors of the community maintained their skills through constant training and periodic raids on hostile neighbors, gradually building a reputation for combat effectiveness that would serve them well in future conflicts. The religious life of the community was centered on the worship of Huitzilopochtli, whose guidance had led them to their new home. The first temple on the island was a modest structure, but it served as the center for solemn ceremonies that reinforced the community's identity and divine patronage. The priests kept a sacred calendar, organized ritual rites marking the agricultural cycle, and preserved historical traditions linking the community to its mythical origins in Aztlan. The transformation of the modest Mexica settlement into the majestic city of Tenochtitlan began in earnest around 1325 when community leaders made the fateful decision to found their permanent capital on the island, where their scouts had seen the prophetic eagle. The date itself carries deep significance in Mexica chronology, corresponding to the year to house in their calendar system, which was considered auspicious for new beginnings and the establishment of lasting institutions. In the initial stage of urban development, the Mexica had to overcome seemingly insurmountable geographical obstacles. The island occupied barely 2 square kilometers of marshy land, which rose only slightly above the lake surface during the dry season, and was frequently flooded during the annual rains. The surrounding waters of Lake Texcoco contained a high concentration of salts and mineral deposits, making them unsuitable for drinking or irrigation. The nearest sources of building stone were located dozens of kilometers away, at the edge of the valley, and access to them was possible only by canoe across open water, which could become dangerous during storms. Despite these obstacles, the Mexica possessed certain advantages that their neighbors overlooked. Decades of migration had taught them to adapt quickly to new environments and extract maximum benefit from meager resources. Their experience as mercenaries provided them with detailed knowledge of the valley's political geography, trade networks, and military potential. Most importantly, their religious conviction that Huitzilopochtli had chosen this exact spot gave them the determination to endure the inevitable hardships of the early settlement period. The expansion of Tenochtitlan beyond its original boundaries required the systematic development of Chinampa's an agricultural system of artificial islands that became one of the most sophisticated farming innovations in human history. Early Chinampas, built in the first decades of the settlement's existence, were primitive and consisted of rectangular plots measuring approximately 30 by 2.5 meters, created by piling lake silt and organic debris inside frames made of woven reeds. The Mexica learned through experience that the key to successful Chinampa construction lay in achieving the right balance of materials and drainage. The foundation of each Chinampa began with the careful selection of a suitable site. In the shallow waters of the lake, where the water depth was between 1 and 3 meters, workers drove stakes of a Hawete willow wood into the lake bottom to mark the boundaries of the planned plot. Between these stakes, they wove walls of reeds and marsh grasses, creating a rectangular enclosure intended to hold the fill material. The bottom layer consisted of thick mats of aquatic vegetation, especially the abundant water hyacinth that grew throughout the lake system. On top of this organic foundation, builders added alternating layers of lake silt and decomposed plant remains, carefully compacting each layer to prevent settling and erosion. The silt was extracted from specific areas of the lakebed where centuries of sediment accumulation had created deep, fertile deposits rich in nutrients. Teams of workers, using wooden scoops and baskets, repeatedly dove to bring up this precious material, a grueling process, requiring exceptional physical endurance and swimming skill. The most important aspect of Chinampa construction was the planting of willows along the perimeter of each artificial island. These fast-growing trees performed several functions. Their extensive root systems securely anchored the Chinampas, protecting them from erosion and wave action. Their branches served as material for tools and construction, and the foliage created windbreaks that protected crops from the strong winds sweeping across the open lake. Willows were planted as cuttings into the newly constructed Chinampas, and within 2 to 3 years, they developed sufficient root mass for the final stabilization of the artificial islands. The agricultural potential of the Chinampa system surpassed even the most optimistic expectations of its creators. The combination of rich lake sediments, constant moisture, and protection from frost created conditions for growing several crops a year. Maize, the staple product of Mesoamerican civilization, flourished in the Chinampa environment, yielding harvests that were 3 to 4 times higher than on traditional rain-fed farms. Beans and squash, the other components of the classic Mesoamerican agricultural trinity, grew on the artificial islands with no less success. The Mexica also discovered that Chinampas were ideal for growing specialized crops in high demand at regional markets. Tomatoes, chili peppers, and various flowering plants thrived in the controlled environment of the floating gardens. Flowers were especially important for religious ceremonies and were in constant demand across the valley. Amaranth, a highly nutritious grain that could be processed into ritual sculptures, became another valuable Chinampa crop, helping Tenochtitlan establish itself as a center of religious innovation. The success of the Chinampa system contributed to rapid population growth. In the first decades of Tenochtitlan's existence, Families that had struggled to feed themselves during the nomadic period now found themselves producing surplus agricultural products that could be exchanged for craft items, raw materials, and luxury goods. Increased food security attracted new settlers, including skilled artisans and specialists who recognized the economic opportunities offered by the growing community. Simultaneously with the development of Tenochtitlan, another Mexica settlement was forming on a neighboring island of Lake Texcoco, Tlatelolco, whose name means place on a round mound of earth. It was founded by a related group of Mexica who had split from the main body during the final stage of migration. According to Indian chronicles, this separation resulted from internal disputes over leadership and religious practices. Although the exact nature of these disagreements remains unclear from surviving sources, the founders of Tlatelolco established their settlement approximately 3 kilometers north of Tenochtitlan on an island that offered certain advantages over the site chosen by their tribesmen. The island of Tlatelolco was slightly larger and higher above the water level, providing more room for initial construction and better protection against seasonal floods. The surrounding waters were also somewhat less salty, which facilitated the creation of fresh water sources. Despite the political division, the residents of Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco maintained close cultural and economic ties. Both communities spoke the same Nahuatl dialect, worshipped the same pantheon of deities, and had almost identical social institutions. Inter-settlement marriages were common, creating kinship networks that transcended political boundaries. The proximity of the two islands facilitated constant communication and cooperation on matters of mutual interest, especially in defense against external threats and the management of shared lake resources. Economic relations between Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco developed along complementary lines, reflecting the strengths and priorities of each community. The leaders of Tenochtitlan focused primarily on military expansion and the creation of political alliances, activities requiring significant investment in weapons, warrior training, and diplomatic gifts. The rulers of Tlatelolco, in contrast, concentrated on developing their settlement as a commercial center that could serve the growing trade networks of the valley. Tlatelolco's strategic position made it an ideal hub for merchants traveling between various city-states around Lake Texcoco. The settlement's harbors could accommodate large cargo canoes transporting wholesale goods across the lake, while its markets provided secure locations for the exchange of valuable commodities. The merchants of Tlatelolco, known as Pachteca, developed extensive trade links extending far beyond the valley, reaching the tropical lands of the Gulf Coast and the regions of the Pacific Coast. The Pachteca of Tlatelolco were more than just traders. They served as intelligence agents, diplomats, and cultural ambassadors for the Mexica people. Their commercial expeditions provided detailed information about distant regions, their resources, political organization, and military potential. This intelligence proved invaluable to the rulers of both Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco when planning expansion and conquest strategies. The growing prosperity of both settlements necessitated improvements in transportation infrastructure. The original inhabitants relied on simple dugout canoes for movement between their islands and the mainland, but the increasing volume of people and cargo required more complex solutions. The construction of causeways connecting the island settlements to the mainland became one of the most ambitious engineering projects of the early period. The first causeway connected Tenochtitlan to the western shore of the lake, providing direct access to the territories controlled by Azcapotzalco, the patrons of the Mexica. This causeway stretched for approximately 8 kilometers across the shallow waters of the lake, requiring the installation of thousands of wooden piles to support the road. Piles were driven deep into the lake bed using wooden hammers operated by teams of workers, standing on floating platforms. Once the piles were installed, horizontal beams were fastened to them using ropes made of maguey fibers, creating a framework capable of supporting the weight of the road. The road itself consisted of a thick layer of stones and rammed earth, raised about 1 meter above the normal water level to prevent flooding during storms. At regular intervals, the causeway was interrupted by removable wooden bridges that could be withdrawn in case of an attack, turning the road into a defensive barrier that trapped enemies on the islands. These bridges also allowed canoes to pass under the causeway, maintaining the free flow of trade essential for the lake economy. The construction of the Western Causeway required unprecedented cooperation between Tenochtitlan and its neighbors. The rulers of Azcapotzalco provided most of the stone and timber needed for the project, while dependent communities provided a massive workforce for the construction works. The project took several years and represented significant investment of resources from all involved parties. In the following decades, new causeways followed, connecting Tenochtitlan to the northern and southern shores of the lake. Each causeway embodied the lessons learned from previous projects, leading to the creation of increasingly complex engineering solutions. The northern causeway was distinguished by a more complex system of bridges, and included elevated sections offering a panoramic view of the surrounding lake system. The southern causeway incorporated a modern aqueduct that delivered fresh water from springs on the mainland to the growing population of the island city. The development of the causeway system transformed Tenochtitlan from an isolated island settlement into a hub of a regional transport network. Merchants, pilgrims, and officials from across the valley could now reach the Mexica capital directly, without the delays and risks associated with water transport. Increased accessibility attracted new settlers and stimulated economic growth, which financed further urban development projects. Parallel to the construction of causeways, Mexica engineers developed a sophisticated system of canals performing multiple functions within the growing city. The main canals followed the natural contours of the island, providing navigable routes through which cargo canoes could reach markets and residential areas throughout the settlement. Secondary canals served as drainage paths, diverting excess water during the rainy season, preventing the floods that plagued the early settlement. The canal system also included complex hydraulic structures regulating water levels. Throughout the city, wooden sluices controlled the flow of water between different sections of the canal network, allowing engineers to direct water where it was needed most. During dry periods, sluices could be adjusted to conserve water in residential areas and chinampa zones. During floods, the same sluices opened to safely divert excess water from the city. The urban planning of Tenochtitlan reflected a careful balance between practical necessity and religious symbolism. The city was organized around a central ceremonial precinct where the most important temples and government buildings were located. This sacred center was oriented to the cardinal points, in accordance with Mesoamerican cosmological principles, with the main temple pyramid facing west toward the setting sun. The ceremonial precinct was surrounded by concentric zones of residential quarters, markets, and specialized craft workshops, each having its own internal organization and leadership structure. Residential areas were organized according to the traditional Kalpuli system, in which each kinship group occupied a separate quarter, including houses, gardens, and small temples dedicated to the group's patron deities. The houses themselves were built using techniques adapted to the unique environment of the lake city. Foundations consisted of wooden platforms raised above the normal water level and anchored on piles driven into the island's substrate. Walls were erected from a combination of stone, adobe bricks, and wooden frames, depending on the availability of materials and the wealth of the residents. The establishment of formal political institutions accompanied the physical development of Tenochtitlan. The position of Huitlatoni, or Great Speaker, emerged as the supreme authority in the growing city-state. The first person to bear this title was Tenoch, the legendary leader, whose name was incorporated into the official name of the city as Tenochtitlan, meaning place of Tenoch. Historical sources provide limited information about Tenoch's actual reign, but later traditions attributed to him the creation of many fundamental institutions that governed society for centuries. The Huitlatoni served simultaneously as secular ruler and high priest, embodying the unity of political and religious power characteristic of a Mesoamerican kingdom. The ruler's responsibilities included leading the community and waging war, overseeing the distribution of land and resources, conducting essential religious ceremonies, and acting as the supreme arbiter in legal disputes. The office was theoretically elective. The ruler was chosen by a council of nobles from among eligible members of the royal line, although in practice succession often followed hereditary patterns. Supporting the Huitlatoni was a complex bureaucracy, managing various aspects of the city administration. The Chiwakobel, or Snake Woman, served as the ruler's chief deputy and handled many day-to-day administrative matters. Military affairs were managed by specialized commanders leading various military societies that formed the backbone of Mexican military power. Religious activities were coordinated by a hierarchy of priests, who kept the complex ceremonial calendar and performed the rituals necessary for the spiritual well-being of the community. The codification of Mexican religious practices during this period laid the theological foundation for the empire that would eventually emerge. The pantheon of deities worshipped in Tenochtitlan reflected the diverse cultural heritage of the community, including elements of their nomadic traditions, their experience as mercenaries, and their interactions with the advanced civilizations of central Mexico. Huitzilopochtli remained the supreme deity, but he was joined by numerous other gods and goddesses governing specific aspects of life. In the Lake City, the religious calendar regulating ritual activity in Tenochtitlan was based on the complex interplay of two separate counting systems: the 260-day Tonalpohualli sacred calendar and the 365-day Xiuhpohualli solar calendar. The combination of these two calendars created a 52-year cycle that served as the fundamental unit of measurement for longer periods of time. The completion of each 52-year cycle was marked by solemn ceremonies involving the ritual destruction of household goods and the rekindling of sacred fires. Throughout the city, the social hierarchy that emerged in early Tenochtitlan reflected both traditional Mexica values and adaptation to their new urban environment. At the top of society were the Pipilin, the noble class including the royal family, high-ranking warriors, and senior priests. The Pipiltin controlled most of the city's wealth and held most important political and religious posts. Their children received specialized education in schools called Holmicak, where they studied the complex skills necessary for leadership in Mexican society. The Mexihualtin, or commoners, constituted the majority of Tenochtitlan's population and included farmers, artisans, merchants, and laborers. Although they lacked the political privileges of the nobility, the Mexihualtin enjoyed significant social mobility through military service, commercial success, or religious zeal. Exceptional warriors could earn noble status for their achievements on the battlefield, while successful traders could accumulate wealth rivaling that of hereditary nobles. At the very bottom of the social hierarchy were the Tlacotin people, who became slaves through war, debt, or criminal prosecution. Slavery in Mexican society differed significantly from the plantation systems that later emerged in other parts of the Americas. Slaves retained certain legal rights, could own property, and could potentially earn or buy their freedom. Many slaves worked as domestic servants in noble houses, while others labored on chinampas or performed religious service. The death of Chimalpopoca, the third ruler of Tenochtitlan, in 1427 became a turning point that transformed the Mexica from tributaries into the dominant force of central Mexico. The assassination of Chimalpopoca, orchestrated by Maxtla, the ambitious new ruler of Azcapotzalco, was the culmination of growing tensions between the Tepanec Empire and its increasingly assertive Mexica vassals. The young ruler of Tenochtitlan was strangled in his palace during what seemed to be a diplomatic meeting, a betrayal that shocked the Mexican nobility and served as a catalyst for revolutionary change. The succession crisis following Chimalpopoca's assassination revealed deep divisions within Mexico society over how to respond to Tepanec aggression. Conservative nobles argued for maintaining the tributary relationship with Azcapotzalco, claiming that open rebellion would lead to the destruction of their still vulnerable island city, They pointed to the overwhelming military superiority of the Tepanec Empire, which controlled most of the western and northern shores of Lake Texcoco, and received tribute from dozens of subordinate communities. The prospect of facing Maxtla's armies without powerful allies seemed suicidal to these cautious voices. However, the faction led by its Coatl of Chimalpopoca and a seasoned military commander advocated for armed resistance. Itzcoatl had observed the internal weaknesses of the Tepanec Empire for decades. During his service as a general under previous rulers, he understood that Maxtla's aggressive policies had caused widespread discontent among many of Azcapotzalco's tributaries, especially in the powerful city-state of Texcoco, which had recently been conquered and humiliated by Tepanec forces. The death of Nezahualcoyotl's father, Ixtlahuaxoquitl, the legitimate ruler of Texcoco, at the hands of the Tepanecs created a potential ally, whose desire for revenge coincided with that of the Mexica. The election of Itzcoatl as the new Huitlatoni signified a decisive rejection of compromise with Azcapotzalco. At the time of his accession, the new ruler was about 50 years old, a mature leader whose military experience and political acumen earned him respect throughout Mexican society. Unlike his predecessors, who came to power during periods of relative stability, Itzcoatl faced immediate existential threats that required bold actions and innovative solutions. His primary task was to create alliances that could counterbalance the Tepanec's military superiority. The most important of these diplomatic initiatives involved secret negotiations with Nezahualcoyotl, the exiled prince of Texcoco, who had lived as a fugitive since the day of his father's death. Nezahualcoyotl possessed deep knowledge of the military capabilities and political vulnerabilities of the Tepanecs, having spent years planning his campaign to reclaim his ancestral throne. The young prince had already begun organizing resistance networks among communities on the eastern shore of the lake, many of whom were burdened by Tepanec dominance and yearned for the restoration of Texcoco's traditional hegemony in the region. The alliance between Itzcoatl and Nezahualcoyotl was officially formalized during a series of clandestine meetings held on small islands in the northern part of Lake Texcoco. These negotiations required extreme secrecy, as Maxtla had placed significant bounties on the heads of both leaders and maintained an extensive network of spies throughout the valley. The two rulers communicated through trusted intermediaries who used encoded messages and traveled at night in unmarked canoes to avoid detection by Tepanec patrols. The third participant in what would become the Triple Alliance was Totoquihuastli, the ruler of Tlacopan, a smaller city-state located on the western shore of the lake. The inclusion of Tlacopan in the alliance reflected both strategic necessity and political calculation. The city controlled vital trade routes between the valley and regions to the west, and its cooperation was essential for maintaining supply lines during the expected conflict with Azcapotzalco. Furthermore, Totoquihuastli commanded significant military forces and possessed detailed knowledge of Tepanec defensive preparations, having served as one of Maxtla's subordinate commanders before secretly defecting to the rebel side. The official creation of the Triple Alliance, known in the Nahuatl language as Ixcantlataloyan, 3 places for speaking, occurred in 1428 and through solemn ceremonies that invoked ancient Mesoamerican traditions of confederation. The 3 rulers met in a neutral location on the lake and participated in ritual bloodletting, which symbolically bound their lineages in an eternal union. Each leader added drops of his blood to a sacred fire, while priests chanted invocations to the gods, asking for divine approval for their confederation. The terms of the alliance were carefully negotiated to reflect the relative contributions and capabilities of each partner. Tenochtitlan, as the initiator of the rebellion and the largest provider of military force, received a dominant position in the confederation. The Mexica ruler was to serve as the supreme military commander during joint campaigns and receive the largest share of tribute from conquered territories. Texcoco, in recognition of Nezahualcoyotl's political legitimacy and administrative expertise, received authority over the eastern regions of the valley and responsibility for managing the legal and bureaucratic affairs of the alliance. Tlacopan, although the smallest of the three partners, was given control over the western territories and a guaranteed share of tribute income. The division of tribute within the alliance followed a carefully calculated formula that persisted throughout the empire's existence. Tenochtitlan claimed 2/5 of all tribute collected from conquered territories, reflecting its position as the senior partner and primary military contributor. Texcoco also received 2/5, in recognition of its crucial role in the alliance and its control over the densely populated eastern regions. Tlacopan received the remaining 1/5, a proportion that accounted for its smaller size, while ensuring its continued loyalty to the Confederation. Military preparations for the war against Azcapotzalco required unprecedented coordination between the three allied city-states. Each partner contributed specialized capabilities that complemented those of the others. Tenochtitlan provided the most numerous contingent of infantrymen, recruited from the growing population of Mexicanos, who had undergone training in traditional Mexican warrior societies. These soldiers were organized into units based on their cultural affiliation, and were armed with obsidian-bladed clubs, spears, and shields decorated with distinctive patterns identifying their origin. Texcoco's contribution to the army was concentrated on elite military units and specialized siege equipment. Nezahualcóyotl had spent years in exile, studying the military innovations of various Mesoamerican cultures, and introduced new tactical concepts that increased the effectiveness of the alliance. Texcoco's engineers built portable bridges that allowed for rapid river crossings, and developed new types of projectile weapons capable of breaching the wooden palisades, protecting Tepanec strongholds. Tlacopan's forces were particularly valuable for their knowledge of the local terrain and experience in conducting amphibious operations. The city's warriors were skilled in the use of war canoes and could conduct coordinated attacks on shore positions inaccessible to conventional infantry forces. They also provided essential intelligence on Tepanec defensive preparations and supply routes, maintaining extensive contacts within the Azcapotzalco military hierarchy. The role of Tlacopan, Itzcoatl's nephew and his chief advisor, proved decisive in transforming these military preparations into a comprehensive strategy of imperial expansion. Tlacopan held the position of Chihuacotl, or Snake Woman, making him the second-ranking official in the Mexica government, and Itzcoatl's designated successor in administrative matters. Unlike previous holders of this office, who were focused primarily on internal management, Tlacopan envisioned a radical restructuring of Mexican society to support sustained military expansion and imperial governance. Tlacopan's reforms began with the reorganization of Mexican military institutions to create a more professional and efficient fighting force. Traditional warrior societies, which had previously been predominantly social and religious organizations, were transformed into disciplined military units with standardized training, equipment, and command structures. Young men were required to undergo rigorous physical training and combat instruction from an early age, with advancement through the military hierarchy depending on demonstrated prowess on the battlefield. The most significant of Tlacopan's military innovations was the institutionalization of the Flower Wars. These ritualized conflicts were designed to provide warriors with opportunities to capture enemies for sacrifice while avoiding the total destruction of potential tributary states. These carefully regulated battles served several purposes. They maintained the combat skills of Mexican warriors during peacetime, ensured a constant flow of victims for religious ceremonies, and demonstrated Mexican military superiority to potential enemies, without the costs associated with total war. Religious reforms accompanied these military changes, as Tlacopan sought to create an ideological framework for Mexican imperial ambitions. The cult of Huitzilopochtli was elevated above all other deities in the pantheon, and the war god was presented as the divine patron of imperial expansion. New myths were created, or existing stories altered to emphasize Huitzilopochtli's role as the protector of the Mexican people and the divine source of their power over other nations. The practice of human sacrifice was systematized and expanded under Tlacael's guidance, becoming a central element of state policy rather than just a religious rite. Large-scale sacrificial ceremonies were organized simultaneously with major military campaigns, where hundreds of captured warriors were sacrificed to the gods to ensure divine favor. For the Mexica armies, these spectacular rituals performed important political functions, demonstrating Mexican power to allies and enemies alike, while reinforcing the religious obligations that bound conquered peoples to their new overlords. The administrative structure that was to govern the expanding empire was created during the preparations for the war with the Tepanecs. Tlacael established new government positions to handle the complex tasks of managing multiple city-states and collecting tribute from distant territories. Professional administrators, recruited from the ranks of the nobility and trained in specialized schools, were appointed to oversee conquered regions and ensure compliance with imperial directives. The tribute system was standardized according to principles that balanced imperial needs and local capabilities. Each conquered territory was assessed based on its population, agricultural productivity, and access to valuable resources. Tribute obligations were carefully calculated to extract maximum benefit, without destroying the local economy or provoking rebellion. Communities producing surplus agricultural products were required to supply specific quantities of maize, beans, and other foodstuffs. Regions with access to luxury goods, such as cacao, precious stones, or exotic feathers, were obligated to provide these materials for imperial needs. Tribute collection was organized through a hierarchical system of local officials, reporting to imperial administrators. Indigenous rulers who submitted peacefully were often allowed to retain their positions as tribute lords, responsible for gathering required goods and delivering them to imperial collection centers. This system of indirect rule minimized the administrative burden on the imperial government, while maintaining local stability and legitimacy. The war against Azcapotzalco began in earnest during the dry season of 1428, when Allied forces launched coordinated attacks on Tepanec strongholds across the Western Valley. The initial phase of the campaign focused on isolating Azcapotzalco from its tributary allies, by capturing strategic towns that controlled key transport routes. Mexican forces, supported by siege specialists from Texcoco, systematically destroyed Tepanec outposts, while Tlacopan's warriors disrupted enemy supply lines through amphibious raids. The siege of Azcapotzalco itself lasted several months, and demonstrated the effectiveness of the alliance's coordinated strategy. Mexican infantry surrounded the land approaches to the city, while Texcoco's engineers erected siege structures that prevented reinforcement forces from reaching the defenders. Tlacopan's canoes controlled the lake approaches, intercepting supply convoys and preventing the evacuation of the Tepanec leadership. The death of Maxtla during the final assault on Azcapotzalco marked the end of Tepanec dominance. In the Valley of Mexico, the fall of the city was followed by the systematic destruction of its temples and administrative buildings, symbolically erasing the political and religious foundations of Tepanec power. The remaining population was resettled into other communities throughout the valley, preventing any future resurgence of Tepanec independence. The victory over Azcapotzalco transformed the political landscape of central Mexico and established the Triple Alliance as the dominant force in the region. The wealth captured during the conquest went to finance massive construction projects in all three allied cities, including the expansion of Tenochtitlan's ceremonial center and the construction of new palaces for the victorious rulers. More importantly, the success of the rebellion demonstrated the effectiveness of the alliance's military and administrative innovations, serving as a model for future conquests across Mesoamerica. The tribute extracted from former Tepanec territories provided the economic foundation for imperial expansion. The rulers of the alliance used these resources to maintain larger armies, support specialized artisans producing luxury goods for diplomatic gifts, and fund the administrative apparatus needed to govern distant provinces. The wealth also allowed for a significant increase in agricultural productivity, by expanding irrigation systems and constructing additional chinampas in the lake system. The consolidation of Triple Alliance power after the defeat of Azcapotzalco created unprecedented opportunities for territorial expansion, which the Mexica rulers were quick to exploit. The tribute flowing from former Tepanec territories provided the economic resources necessary to maintain professional armies, while the alliances demonstrated military effectiveness, attracted additional city-states seeking protection or partnership. Within a decade of Maxtla's death, the Confederation controlled most of the Valley of Mexico and began extending its influence into the surrounding highland regions. The death of Itzcoatl in 1414 brought to power his nephew Moctezuma I Camina, known to history as Moctezuma I, whose reign would witness the transformation of the Triple Alliance from a regional confederation into a true empire encompassing most of central Mexico. The new Huitlatoni was about 35 years old at the time of his accession. He had spent his youth as a warrior in the campaigns against Azcapotzalco, and his early maturity as a military commander under his uncle's leadership. Unlike previous rulers who inherited relatively stable situations, Moctezuma I faced the challenge of managing an expanding state, while simultaneously waging military campaigns that spread Mexico influence far beyond the traditional boundaries of central Mexican politics. The administrative system Moctezuma inherited from his predecessors required significant changes to adapt to the complexities of governing distant territories inhabited by various ethnic groups with different levels of political development. The tribute collection mechanisms that proved effective in the Valley of Mexico needed adaptation for regions where different languages were spoken, other agricultural systems were practiced, and local political structures had little resemblance to the city-state organization familiar to Mexico administrators. Moctezuma I's first major military campaign was directed against the Huastec peoples on the Gulf Coast, a region that had previously remained largely independent of central Mexican influence. Despite its proximity to the highland valleys, the Huasteca, as this territory was called, encompassed fertile lands stretching from the Sierra Madre Oriental to the Gulf of Mexico, an area characterized by abundant rainfall, rich alluvial soils, and access to valuable resources, including cotton, cacao, and exotic bird feathers prized for ceremonial purposes. The Huastec peoples themselves represented a serious challenge to Mexico expansion. They had developed complex agricultural systems adapted to the humid environment, building extensive drainage networks that allowed for the intensive cultivation of maize, beans, and cotton in areas that would otherwise have been too marshy for productive farming. Their settlements were typically built on raised platforms, providing protection from seasonal floods and facilitating trade along the numerous rivers crossing the coastal plain. Huastec military organization differed substantially from the military society systems familiar to the Mexica. Instead of hierarchical structures based on individual combat prowess, characteristic of highland armies, Huastec forces emphasized collective tactics and the coordinated use of projectile weapons. Their warriors were skilled archers, using powerful composite bows, capable of piercing the cotton armor typically worn by Mesoamerican soldiers. They also made extensive use of poisoned arrows and darts, weapons considered dishonorable by highland standards but proving extremely effective in the dense vegetation of the coastal lowlands. The logistical difficulties of conducting military operations in the Huasteca required innovative solutions from Mexica planners. The tropical climate posed health threats to highland warriors unaccustomed to high humidity and endemic diseases. The dense forest cover made traditional infantry formations ineffective, while numerous rivers and marshes hindered the movement of large armies. Supply lines stretched for hundreds of kilometers from the highland valleys were vulnerable to interception by hostile forces familiar with the local landscape. Moctezuma I addressed these problems with a combination of diplomatic preparation and tactical adaptation. Advanced agents were sent into Huastec territory months before the main military expedition to establish relationships with local leaders who could be persuaded to support Mexico goals. In exchange for favorable treatment by the New imperial administration. These diplomatic missions also gathered vital intelligence on Huastec military potential, political divisions, and economic resources, forming the basis for subsequent military planning. The Mexica forces that eventually invaded the Huasteca in 1444 represented a significant departure from traditional highland military organization. Instead of the massive armies that had proved effective in the Valley of Mexico, Moctezuma deployed smaller, mobile units capable of operating effectively in the difficult conditions of the coastal lands. These expeditionary forces included specialists trained in jungle warfare, engineers capable of building temporary bridges across rivers and marshes, and medical personnel familiar with tropical diseases and their treatments. The campaign itself unfolded over several years, during which Mexican forces systematically suppressed Huastec strongholds, establishing permanent garrisons to secure their conquests. The process required careful attention to local political dynamics, as the Huasteca was not a unified state, but a collection of independent communities, with complex relationships of alliance and rivalry. Mexica commanders learned to exploit these divisions, supporting local leaders willing to recognize imperial authority and isolating and destroying those who insisted on continued independence. The local rulers who submitted to Mexico authority were allowed to retain their posts as tribute lords, responsible for collecting tribute and maintaining order in their territories. The tribute obligations imposed on Huastec communities reflected both imperial needs and local capabilities. Agricultural regions were required to supply specific quantities of cotton, maize, and other food products. Meanwhile, communities with access to specialized resources, such as amber, tropical hardwoods, or medicinal plants, were obliged to provide these materials for imperial use. Tribute assessments were carefully calculated to extract maximum benefit, without destroying the local economy or provoking rebellions that would require costly military intervention. The success of the Huasteca campaigns created a model of imperial expansion that was applied throughout the reign of Moctezuma I. The combination of diplomatic preparation, tactical adaptation, and administrative flexibility proved effective in regions with diverse ecological and cultural characteristics. The wealth extracted from conquered territories financed further military expeditions, while the administrative experience gained in managing distant provinces expanded the empire's capacity for further expansion. After consolidating Mexican control over the Huasteca, Moctezuma I turned his attention to the southern regions of the empire, targeting the Mixtec and Zapotec peoples in Oaxaca. This mountainous region presented different difficulties than the coastal lowlands, as the landscape was characterized by deep valleys separated by rugged highlands, making troop movement difficult and communication between scattered settlements problematic. The political organization of Oaxaca differed significantly from both the city-state systems of central Mexico and the communal societies of the Huasteca. The Mixtec peoples had created complex kingdoms centered in fortified hilltop cities that controlled the surrounding agricultural valleys. These kingdoms were ruled by hereditary nobles claiming divine descent and maintaining complex court systems that rivaled those of the major powers of central Mexico. The Zapotec civilization, centered in the ancient city of Montealb, possessed even more sophisticated political institutions and had maintained its independence for centuries through a combination of military prowess and diplomatic skill. Conquering Oaxaca required a different approach than the rapid campaigns that had proven successful in other regions. The mountainous terrain favored defensive warfare, allowing relatively small forces to hold strategic passes against much larger armies. The dispersed nature of populated areas meant that the conquest of individual communities did not necessarily ensure control over surrounding territories, as other settlements could continue to resist from their own fortified positions. Moctezuma's strategy for conquering Oaxaca emphasized the systematic suppression of enemy strongholds through prolonged siege warfare. Mexican engineers developed new methods for conducting operations in mountainous terrain, including portable siege equipment that could be disassembled for transport. through narrow mountain passes and reassembled at the target site. They also improved methods for cutting off water supplies to mountain fortresses, forcing defenders to surrender when their supplies were exhausted. The Oaxaca campaign stretched for nearly a decade, as Mexican forces methodically conquered one valley after another, establishing permanent garrisons to prevent recapture by enemy forces. The process required a colossal investment of manpower and resources, as supply lines stretched for hundreds of kilometers over difficult terrain, were vulnerable to attacks by hostile forces familiar with local conditions. The wealth extracted from Oaxacan territories more than compensated for the costs of conquest. The region was famous throughout Mesoamerica for its skilled artisans who produced luxury items, including gold jewelry, carved jade products, and intricately decorated textiles. The tribute obligations imposed on the conquered communities of Oaxaca reflected these specialized abilities and included requirements for the delivery of precious metals, gemstones, and finished craft products, which enhanced the prestige of the imperial court in Tenochtitlan. The death of Moctezuma in 1469 brought to power his son Axayacatl, a young ruler whose reign would be marked by both brilliant military successes and costly failures that demonstrated the limits of Mexican military power. Axayacatl was about 20 years old at the time of his accession. He had spent his youth training as a warrior in elite schools that prepared noble youth for leadership roles in Mexican society. Unlike his father, who inherited a relatively stable empire and gradually expanded its borders through carefully planned campaigns, Axayacatl faced immediate challenges requiring rapid military responses. The most pressing of these challenges involved the growing independence of Tlatelolco, a sister city, founded by Mexican settlers on an island adjacent to Tenochtitlan. In the decades since its founding, Tlatelolco had evolved into a major commercial center whose merchants the Pochteka maintained trade relations throughout Mesoamerica. The wealth generated by this trade allowed the rulers of Tlatelolco to maintain their own military forces and conduct independent diplomatic relations with other city-states, activities that increasingly came into conflict with Tenochtitlan's claims to supremacy in the Mexica domains. The conflict between Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco reflected deeper tensions within Mexican society regarding the proper balance between commercial and military activity. Tlatelolco merchants accumulated vast wealth in their trade expeditions, but lacked the military achievements that traditionally gave high status in Mexican society. Conversely, the warrior nobility of Tenochtitlan possessed military credentials that legitimized political power but depended on commercial revenues to finance their military expeditions and maintain a luxurious lifestyle. The immediate cause of the war between the two cities was a succession dispute in Tlatelolco, which gave Axayacatl a pretext for military intervention. When Moquihui, the ruler of Tlatelolco, died without leaving a clear heir, rival factions within the city turned to external allies for support. Axayacatl supported one claimant, while other forces in the valley supported alternative candidates, creating a complex web of alliances that threatened to destabilize the entire region. The Siege of Tlatelolco in 1473 demonstrated military innovations developed in previous decades of imperial expansion. Mexican engineers built complex siege structures that isolated the city from external support, while simultaneously protecting their own forces from counterattacks. The use of coordinated infantry attacks supported by projectile weapons proved effective against Tlatelolco's defenses, which were designed primarily to repel raids rather than for prolonged siege warfare. The fall of Tlatelolco marked the end of independent Mexican city-states and the consolidation of imperial power under the direct control of Tenochtitlan. The commercial networks of the conquered city were incorporated into the imperial administration, providing the central government with unprecedented control over long-distance trade. Throughout Mesoamerica, the wealth of the Tlatelolco merchants was redistributed to reward loyal supporters of the imperial regime, and the city's military forces were integrated into the imperial army as auxiliary units. Axayacatl's attention then turned westward to the Tarascan Empire, a powerful confederation centered in the region now known as Mythical. The Etruscans had created a complex military organization based on bronze weapons and disciplined infantry formations that had proven effective against traditional Mesoamerican armies armed with obsidian weapons and relying on individual combat prowess. Their capital, Zinzunzun, controlled vast territories rich in copper, silver, and other metals essential for producing the bronze tools and weapons that gave Etruscan troops a technological advantage. The Etruscan Empire represented the most formidable military challenge ever faced by Mexican forces. Unlike the city-states of central Mexico or the communal societies of peripheral regions, the Etruscans created centralized military institutions capable of fielding large, well-equipped armies under a single command. Their bronze weapons were superior to obsidian tools in both durability and effectiveness, while their disciplined formations proved more effective than the individualistic fighting styles preferred by Mexican warriors. The campaign against the Etruscans began in 1478 with a series of probing attacks designed to test enemy capabilities and identify potential weaknesses in their defensive systems. These initial encounters revealed the extent of Etruscan military superiority, as Mexican forces suffered heavy losses while achieving minimal tactical success. The bronze-armed Etruscan infantry proved their ability to maintain formation discipline under pressure, while their archers demonstrated superior range and accuracy compared to Mexican projectile weapons. The decisive battle of the campaign occurred at a site whose exact name remains a subject of debate among historians, but which contemporary sources describe as a broad plain suitable for large-scale infantry combat. Axayacatl assembled the largest army in Mexican history, drawing warriors from across the empire and including significant contingents from allied city-states. The Etruscan forces were smaller, but better equipped and more cohesively organized. Bronze weapons glinted in the morning sun as disciplined formations advanced across the battlefield. The battle began with an exchange of projectiles, as both armies sought to disrupt enemy formations before the main infantry clash. Etruscan archers, protected by large shields and supported by slingers, maintained a continuous barrage that caused significant losses among the advancing Mexican warriors. The arrowheads and dart points made of obsidian, used by the Mexican forces, proved less effective against the bronze armor and shields of the Etruscans, creating an immediate advantage that persisted throughout the engagement. When the infantry lines finally met, the superior metallurgy of the Etruscan weapons became decisive. Bronze swords and spearheads pierced the cotton armor and wooden shields that provided adequate protection against obsidian weapons. The disciplined formations of the Etruscan units allowed them to concentrate their attacks on specific sections of the Mexican line, creating gaps that could be exploited by subsequent assaults. The defeat at the hands of the Etruscans became the first major military setback in the Mexican imperial expansion and demonstrated the limitations of traditional Mesoamerican military technologies when facing more advanced metallurgical methods. The losses sustained by the Mexican forces were significant, including many experienced warriors whose loss substantially reduced the empire's military potential. More importantly, the defeat damaged the prestige of Mexican arms and encouraged resistance movements in recently conquered territories. The social fabric of the Aztec Empire relied on a complex hierarchy that determined every aspect of an individual's existence, from the clothes they wore to the food they consumed and the gods to whom they could turn in prayer. At the top of this stratified society stood the peoples in the hereditary nobility, whose lineages trace back to the legendary rulers of Tolan and the divine mandate of Quetzalcoatl. These nobles occupied palace complexes in the ceremonial centers of major cities. Their houses were built of carefully carved stone blocks and decorated with intricate frescoes, depicting the heroic deeds of their ancestors and divine connections. The Peopleton controlled vast estates worked by peasant tenants and maintained private armies of professional warriors who served both as military force and as a symbol of aristocratic power. Noble families owned exquisite feather-working workshops, where skilled artisans created magnificent headdresses and ceremonial clothing that distinguished the elite from commoners. Their children were educated in the Kolmakak exclusive schools at major temples, where they studied the complex writing system, astronomical calculations, and ritual procedures necessary for governing the empire's diverse population. Within the noble class itself, careful distinctions separated different ranks and privileges that acutely held the highest officers, serving as provincial governors, Supreme Court judges, and military commanders, leading major campaigns. These individuals possessed hereditary rights to specific territories and received tribute directly from subordinate communities. Below them were the pili, younger sons of noble families and distinguished warriors, who earned elevation through exceptional achievements on the battlefield. The pili served as administrators, priests, and military officers, forming the backbone of the imperial bureaucracy. The Makehulting constituted the vast majority of the empire's population, including farmers, artisans, merchants, and laborers whose daily toil sustained the complex urban centers and agricultural systems, providing for imperial expansion. Unlike the hereditary nobility, commoners had no automatic right to political office or religious authority. However, their social standing was far from static. Distinguished warriors could earn noble status by capturing enemy soldiers, while successful traders accumulated wealth rivaling that of hereditary aristocrats. Commoner families lived in modest adobe houses clustered around neighborhood temples, dedicated to the patron deities of their kalpuli. These residential complexes usually included small inner courtyards, where women ground maize on stone metates and men manufactured tools from obsidian, wood, and bone. Walls were decorated with simple geometric patterns painted in earth tones, and floors consisted of packed clay covered with woven mats that served as sleeping surfaces and dining areas. The economic activities of the Makehulting varied significantly, depending on their location in the empire and the natural resources available in their regions. In the Valley of Mexico, many commoners worked on the extensive Chinampa systems surrounding Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco, growing maize, beans, squash, tomatoes, and chili peppers on artificial islands floating on the lake surface. These farmers possessed detailed knowledge of water management methods, crop rotation cycles, and soil preparation techniques that maximized agricultural productivity. In the complex lacustrine conditions, artisans formed specialized guilds that controlled the production and distribution of essential goods throughout the empire. Stonemasons quarried volcanic rock in the mountains surrounding the valley and transformed it into grain grinders, building blocks, and sculptural elements for temples and palaces. Obsidian masters created razor-sharp blades that armed warriors and served as cutting tools for daily use. Their workshops filled with the musical tinkling of stone flakes falling to the ground. A skilled craftsman shaped volcanic glass into lethal implements. Textile production occupied thousands of women across the empire, from noble ladies overseeing complex workshops to simple wives who spun cotton and maguey fibers in their spare time in the evenings after completing household duties. The complexity of textile patterns indicated the social status of the wearer. Geometric patterns in natural colors marked the clothing of commoners, while intricate pictorial designs in brilliant dyes distinguished the attire of the nobility. The most prestigious fabrics used exotic materials such as rabbit fur, tropical bird feathers, and thread spun from precious metals. The Pochtica held a unique position in Aztec society, serving as long-distance merchants whose trade expeditions expanded the empire's economic influence far beyond its military borders. These professional traders belonged to hereditary guilds that maintained their own temples, schools, and judicial systems separate from those of other social groups. Pochtica expeditions resembled military campaigns in their organization and scale. Armed guards protected valuable cargo, as merchant caravans traveled hundreds of kilometers through hostile territories to reach distant markets. The wealth accumulated by successful Pochtica allowed them to live in luxury rivaling that of the nobility. However, their commercial origins prevented them from holding high political office or participating in the most exclusive religious ceremonies. This tension between economic power and social status created a complex dynamic in Aztec society, as the recognized nobility sought to control merchant activities, while successful traders attempted to convert their wealth into political influence through strategic marriages and religious patronage. At the very bottom of the social hierarchy were the Tlacotin people, who lost their freedom through war, debt, or criminal offense. Aztec slavery fundamentally differed from the plantation systems that later emerged in other parts of the Americas, as slaves retained certain legal rights and could own property, marry of their own will, and potentially earn or buy their freedom. Many Tlacotin worked as domestic servants in noble houses where they performed specialized tasks, such as cooking, textile production, and childcare requiring skill and trust. The educational systems transmitting Aztec culture from generation to generation reflected and reinforced the empire's social stratification, while providing mechanisms for limited social mobility. The Calmecac served the children of the nobility and successful traders, offering rigorous training in writing, mathematics, astronomy, history, and religious rituals. Students of these elite schools learned to read and interpret complex pictographic codices, recording imperial laws, tribute obligations, and historical events. They studied the complex calendar systems regulating religious rites and agricultural activities, mastering calculations that predicted eclipses, determined favorable dates for military campaigns, and coordinated festivities across the vast territories of the empire. The Calmecac curriculum emphasized moral discipline and intellectual rigor. Students were subject to harsh punishments for academic failure or behavioral infractions. Young nobles learned to pierce their tongues, ears, and genitals with obsidian blades and maguey thorns as acts of religious zeal, while memorizing complex poems and songs that preserved historical traditions and mythological narratives. The schools possessed extensive libraries of codices written on tree bark and deerskin, containing the knowledge accumulated over centuries of Mesoamerican civilization. The Tenochtitlan provided education for the children of commoners, focusing on practical skills and military training rather than the esoteric knowledge reserved for the elite. These neighborhood schools taught boys to use weapons effectively, perform basic religious ceremonies, and understand their duties as tribute-paying subjects of the empire. Girls received instruction in textile production, food preparation, and household management from experienced women who transmitted traditional techniques through practical demonstration and practice. Military training in the Tenochtitlan began with wooden weapons and progressed to obsidian tools. As students demonstrated competence and maturity, young warriors learned to fight in formation, coordinate attacks with other units, and capture enemies alive for sacrifice. The schools also taught the manufacture and maintenance of military gear, including the cotton armor that protected warriors in battle, and exquisite shields decorated with feathers and precious stones, which indicated their owners' achievements and social status. Daily life in Tenochtitlan revolved around the complex rhythms of the ritual calendar and the practical demands of urban existence in a city of 150,000 to 300,000 people. The urban landscape consisted of interconnected islands joined by causeways and canals serving as transport arteries for the constant flow of people and goods. Residential areas were organized according to Calpulli affiliation, with each quarter having its own temple, school, and marketplace where local products were exchanged for goods from other parts of the city and empire. Housing styles varied greatly depending on social status and economic resources. Noble residences occupied vast areas, including several buildings arranged around courtyards planted with flowers and shade trees. Main structures had stone foundations, adobe brick walls, and flat roofs serving as additional living and working space. Interior rooms were decorated with complex frescoes depicting mythological scenes, historical events, and genealogical information confirming the noble origin of the inhabitants. Commoners' houses were smaller and simpler, usually consisting of 1 or 2 rooms with thatched roofs and walls made of adobe or wattle. and daub. These modest dwellings nevertheless provided adequate shelter, and included elements such as built-in storage niches, raised sleeping platforms, and small shrines dedicated to household deities. Many houses included workshops where family members engaged in specialized crafts. Pottery kilns, looms, and tool-making areas were integrated into the domestic architecture. The clothing of Tenochtitlan residents served as an immediate indicator of social status, occupation, and regional origin. Nobles dressed in elaborately decorated garments of cotton fabrics dyed in bright colors, and adorned with geometric patterns, featherwork, and precious stone jewelry. Men wore loincloths, capes, and sandals, while women donned skirts and blouses that modestly covered the body and demonstrated family wealth and status through the quality of materials and decoration. Commoners were legally restricted to wearing simple clothing made of maguey fiber, dyed in muted earth tones and decorated with basic geometric patterns. Men typically wore loincloths and knee-length capes, and women simple skirts and blouses where functionality prevailed over ornamentation. Sumptuary laws regulating clothing choices were strictly enforced, and persons attempting to dress above their social standing faced harsh punishments. The food consumed by various social groups reflected both the economic resources and cultural preferences developed over centuries of Mesoamerican civilization. Nobles enjoyed exquisite dishes made of exotic ingredients brought from remote regions of the empire, including tropical fruits, sea fish, and wild fowl unavailable to commoners. Specialized cooks worked in their kitchens preparing complex dishes seasoned with rare spices and serving them in decorated ceramic vessels demonstrating the owner's refined taste. Maize formed a staple of all Aztec diets, consumed in various forms including tortillas, tamales, porridges, and fermented beverages providing essential calories and nutrients. Commoner families supplemented their maize-based meals with beans, squash, chili peppers, and whatever protein sources they could afford, including small game, fish from the lake system, and domestic dogs and turkeys raised in their households. The market system centered in Tlatelolco represented one of the most sophisticated commercial institutions in pre-Columbian America, attracting merchants and buyers from across Mesoamerica to exchange goods in a carefully regulated environment. The main market occupied a vast square capable of accommodating more than 60 people on major trading days, with specialized sections dedicated to different categories of goods. Vendors spread their wares on woven mats, creating colorful displays demonstrating the empire's economic diversity and production capacity. Food vendors offered prepared meals, fresh produce, and delicacies such as chocolate drinks with honey and spices, providing refreshment to buyers and workers. Artisans sold pottery, textiles, tools, and decorative items demonstrating the high level of artistic achievement of Aztec craftsmen. Merchants from distant regions displayed exotic goods including jade jewelry from Guatemala, amber from Chiapas, and tropical bird feathers from the coast, adding luxury and prestige to noble houses. The market operated according to strict rules enforced by appointed officials, who monitored weights and measures, resolved disputes between buyers and sellers, and maintained order in the shopping crowds. Prices were set through negotiation, with cacao beans serving as a standard medium of exchange for small transactions, while cotton cloths and quills filled with gold dust facilitated large purchases. Aztec artistic achievements spanned a wide range of materials and techniques reflecting both religious zeal and aesthetic sophistication. Sculptors carved massive stone monuments decorating temple complexes and public spaces, creating powerful images of deities, rulers, and mythological scenes communicating imperial ideology to the diverse population. The famous sunstone Aztec calendar, discovered in Tenochtitlan's main square, exemplified the integration of artistic skill with astronomical knowledge. Its intricate carvings depicted the cyclical nature of time and the cosmic forces governing human destiny. Featherwork represented perhaps the most distinctive Aztec artistic tradition. Skilled masters created complex compositions from tropical bird plumage, arranged in intricate patterns and designs. These magnificent works adorn the costumes of nobles and priests during important ceremonies. Their bright colors and complex detailing served as symbols of divine patronage and social distinction. The techniques for creating feather masterpieces were closely guarded secrets passed down within hereditary guilds, maintaining exclusive control over this prestigious art form. Codex production represented the pinnacle of Aztec intellectual achievement, combining artistic skill with scholarly knowledge to create documents preserving historical records, religious teachings, and administrative information. Scribes trained in the Colmecac schools painted pictographic symbols on bark paper and deerskin using animal hair brushes and pigments derived from minerals, plants, and insects. The resulting manuscripts served as libraries, legal documents, and educational materials transmitting knowledge across generations and empire territories. The Aztec calendar system demonstrated complex mathematical and astronomical knowledge accumulated over centuries of Mesoamerican observations and calculations. The basic structure combined a 260-day ritual calendar with a 365-day solar calendar, creating a complex cycle requiring 52 years to complete. This system allowed Aztec astronomers to predict eclipses, track planetary movements, and coordinate religious festivals with agricultural activities. In various climatic zones of the empire, the religious worldview governing Aztec society relied on a complex understanding of cosmic forces, locked in eternal struggle, where human survival depended on maintaining a fragile balance through ritual actions and propitiating the gods. At the center of this intricate theological system stood Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun in the form of a hummingbird, whose daily journey across the sky embodied the eternal battle between light and darkness, order and chaos, life and death. The Mexica understood their patron god as a young warrior born fully armed from the womb of his mother Coatlicue, destined to protect the world from forces of destruction, threatening to plunge creation back into primordial darkness. Huitzilopochtli's mythological biography laid the theological foundation for Aztec imperial expansion and their military culture. According to sacred narratives preserved in temple schools and recited during religious ceremonies, the god was conceived when his mother, the earth goddess Coatlicue, became pregnant from a ball of hummingbird feathers that fell from the sky. While she was sweeping the temple on Coatpec, his jealous siblings, led by his sister Coilshulqui, the moon goddess, conspired to kill their mother before the miraculous birth could occur. Considering the pregnancy a source of shame for their family, Huitzilopochtli's birth marked the beginning of a cosmic war that would define Aztec religious consciousness. Appearing from his mother's womb as an adult warrior armed with a fire serpent and a shield decorated with eagle feathers, the newborn god immediately attacked his siblings, threatening his mother. In the following battle, Huitzilopochtli dismembered Coilshulqui and cast her head into the sky, where it became the moon, while simultaneously scattering the rest of his siblings across the heavens as stars. This primordial conflict established a model of cosmic struggle that required constant renewal through human actions and divine intervention. The daily solar cycle was understood as a repetition of Huitzilopochtli's eternal battle against the forces of darkness. Every dawn represented the young god's victory over his siblings, while every sunset marked the beginning of his nightly journey through the underworld, where he fought the lords of death and gloom so that the sun could rise again. This cosmic drama required human participation through ritual activity that gave the god the strength necessary to continue the struggle. The most important of these rituals involved the offering of human blood and hard substances containing the vital essence necessary to nourish the solar deity and sustain the existence of the world. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent deity, represented a contrasting but complementary aspect of Aztec religious thought. In contrast to Huitzilopochtli's association with war and sacrifice, Quetzalcoatl embodied wisdom, creativity, and the civilizing arts that distinguish humans from animals. The god was credited with creating humanity in the current cosmic era by mixing his own blood with bones stolen from the underworld, a heroic act that established the fundamental debt of humans to the divine world. Quetzalcoatl also gave humans maize, the sacred grain that became the foundation of Mesoamerican civilization by transforming into an ant and carrying the precious seeds out of their hiding place inside a mountain. The dual nature of Quetzalcoatl's symbolism reflected the Aztec understanding of the fundamental contradictions characterizing existence. As a feathered serpent, the deity combined the earthly nature of reptiles with the celestial freedom of birds, representing the unity of opposites governing cosmic processes. The god's association with the wind united him with the invisible forces, bringing rain clouds from the ocean and dispersing plant seeds over vast distances, making him indispensable for agricultural fertility and seasonal renewal. Quetzalcoatl's role as the patron of knowledge and the priesthood made him especially important to the educated elite governing Aztec society. It was believed that the god invented the calendar systems regulating religious rites and agricultural activities and created the writing systems that preserved historical knowledge and religious teachings. Priests serving in his temples underwent rigorous training in astronomy, mathematics, and ritual procedures, becoming the intellectual leaders who maintained the complex ceremonial cycles, ensuring cosmic order. Tezcatlipoca, whose name meant smoking mirror, embodied the darker aspects of divine power that the Aztecs recognized as necessary components of cosmic balance. This deity was associated with the night, jaguars, sorcery, and unpredictable forces that could bring human communities either great fortune or crushing destruction. Tezcatlipoca was often depicted as a young man without one foot, which was bitten off by an earth monster during the creation of the world, a sacrifice that allowed for the formation of the solid ground on which humans could build their civilizations. The relationship between Tezcatlipoca and Quetzalcoatl formed one of the central themes of Aztec mythology. The two deities were locked in an eternal rivalry that drove the cycles of creation and destruction shaping cosmic history. According to sacred narratives, these divine conflicts resulted in the destruction and recreation of the world several times, with each cosmic era ending when one deity gained temporary supremacy over the other. The current era of the world, known as the Fifth Sun, was created through the cooperation of all the gods, but even it was doomed to catastrophic destruction unless humans maintained proper ritual relations with the divine world. Tlaloc, the rain god, governed the life-giving waters that made agriculture possible in the semi-arid environments of central Mexico. This ancient deity, whose worship preceded the arrival of the Mexica by many centuries, was depicted as a figure with eyes resembling goggles and prominent fangs, often surrounded by symbols representing clouds, lightning, and falling rain. Tlaloc's mountain shrines dotted the landscape around the Valley of Mexico, marking the sacred peaks where rain clouds gathered, and from which life-sustaining moisture descended to nourish the crops, feeding the empire's growing population. Worship of Tlaloc included complex ceremonies recognizing the god's control over the agricultural cycles on which human survival depended. In the dry season, priests conducted rituals designed to attract the rain clouds that would bring the moisture necessary for planting and crop growth. These ceremonies often involved the sacrifice of children, whose tears were believed to be especially pleasing to the rain god, and whose innocent suffering could incline him to compassion for human needs. The child victims were often purchased from poor families or captured during war, then exquisitely dressed and honored before being sacrificed to the deity in mountain shrines, or thrown into sacred cenotes. The Aztec understanding of cosmic time was structured around the concept of the 5 suns, successive world eras created and destroyed as a result of the actions of rival deities. Each cosmic era was under the rule of its own god and ended with a specific form of catastrophe, reflecting the particular characteristics and powers of the ruling deity. The first sun was ruled by Tezcatlipoca and ended when Quetzalcoatl knocked his rival from the sky, causing him to transform into a jaguar that devoured all the giants inhabiting the world. The second sun was governed by Quetzalcoatl and ended when Tezcatlipoca's revenge turned humans into monkeys. and destroyed their civilization with hurricanes. The third sun was ruled by Tlaloc and ended with a rain of fire that consumed the world, and turned its human inhabitants into birds. The fourth sun was ruled by Tlaloc's consort, the goddess of rivers and lakes, and ended with a great flood, turning humans into fish and destroying all fruits of civilization. The current fifth sun, known as Nahuialin, or full movement, was created through the self-sacrifice of the gods, who threw themselves into a cosmic bonfire to provide the energy necessary for the sun and moon to move across the sky. The creation of the fifth sun established the theological framework justifying human sacrifice as a cosmic necessity rather than merely a religious preference. According to sacred narratives, the gods sacrificed themselves to create the current world era, establishing a precedent requiring humans to reciprocate through their own offerings of blood and life. The god Nanahuitzin, a humble and diseased deity, volunteered to throw himself into the cosmic fire to become the sun, while the proud god Texcoco hesitated before following suit to become the moon. This mythological event demonstrated that divine sacrifice is necessary to maintain cosmic order, and that humans owe their existence to the gods' willingness to give their lives for the continuation of the world. The ritual calendar governing Aztec religious life was based on the complex interplay of the 260-day Tonalpohualli and the 365-day Xiupohualli, creating cycles of sacred time regulating both individual destiny and community obligations. The Tonalpohualli combined 20-day signs with 13 numbers to form a sacred calendar, used for divination, naming children, and determining favorable dates for important matters. Each day in this calendar was governed by specific deities, and possessed particular characteristics influencing the fate of people born on that date, and the success of activities undertaken during that period. The Xiupohualli consisted of 18 months of 20 days each, plus 5 additional days considered unlucky and dangerous. Each month was dedicated to specific deities, and included specific ceremonies maintaining proper relations between humans and gods. Throughout the annual cycle, festivals associated with each month required careful preparation involving the entire community, from gathering ritual materials to constructing temporary temples and training ceremony participants. The new fire ceremony, held every 52 years when the 2 calendar cycles simultaneously returned to their starting positions, represented the most important ritual in the Aztec religious system. This complex ceremony, known as Xihmolpili, or binding of the years, involved the extinguishing of all fires throughout the empire, and the ritual destruction of household items, pottery, and clothing. The population fasted and remained awake all night, anxiously awaiting the successful conclusion of the ceremony that would ensure the continuation of the current world era. The ceremony itself took place on a sacred mountain outside Tenochtitlan, where priests closely observed the movement of the Pleiades constellation to determine the exact moments the new cycle began. At the critical moment, a fire priest used a wooden drill to kindle a new flame on the chest of a victim, whose heart had been removed to clear a sacred space for cosmic renewal. If the fire caught successfully, it confirmed that the gods had agreed to allow the world to exist for another 52-year cycle. The new fire was then carried to temples throughout the empire, where it was used to rekindle the sacred fires that burned continuously in honor of various deities. Seasonal festivals marking the agricultural cycle provided communities across the empire with regular opportunities to participate in ritual activity, maintaining cosmic balance. The festival of Alcahualo, celebrated in the first month of the year, honored the mountain spirits governing rainfall through ceremonies involving the sacrifice of children in mountain shrines. The festival of Tlacaxapualisti, held in the second month, involved the blessing of maize seeds and the performance of rituals designed to ensure successful planting and crop growth. The festival of Tozoztantli, celebrated in the third month, marked the beginning of the planting season, with solemn ceremonies honoring the earth goddess Coatlicue and her various manifestations. The festival of Toxcatl, held in the fourth month, involved the selection and sacrifice of a young man chosen to personify the god Tezcatlipoca for an entire year. This individual, known as the Xiptlatli, or image of the god, lived in luxury and was treated as a living deity before being sacrificed at the festival's climax, thereby ensuring the constant presence of the god among his people. The practice of human sacrifice permeated Aztec religious life at all levels, from grand ceremonies marking major festivals to daily offerings, maintaining sacred fires. In neighborhood temples, the Aztecs recognized several forms of sacrificial death, each corresponding to different deities and ceremonial contexts. The most common method involved extracting the victim's heart while they were still alive. The procedure required significant skill and was performed by specially trained priests, using obsidian knives with razor-sharp edges. Heart sacrifice usually took place on the steps of pyramid temples. The victim was stretched on their back over a curved stone that pushed the chest upward, facilitating the priest's task. Four assistants held the victim's limbs while the priest made a swift incision below the ribs, reached into the chest cavity, and extracted the still-beating heart. The organ was then offered to the deity placed in a special vessel or raised toward the sun, while the victim's body was rolled down the temple steps to waiting attendants who disposed of it, according to ritual requirements. Drowning was the preferred method of sacrifice for victims offered to Tlaloc, and other water deities. Ceremonies often took place at sacred springs, lakes, or in specially built pools at temple complexes. The victims, who were often children whose tears were believed to be especially pleasing to the rain god, were dressed in exquisite costumes and jewelry before being thrown into the water, or held beneath the surface until death occurred. These sacrifices were often conducted during droughts, when the community desperately needed divine intervention to send life-giving rain. Flaying was used in ceremonies honoring Xiptotec, the god of spring and agricultural renewal, whose name meant our Lord the Flayed One. Victims offered to this deity first had their hearts extracted in the traditional manner, after which their skin was carefully removed in its entirety. Priests wore these human skins during subsequent rituals, symbolically representing the renewal of life occurring each spring, when plants shed their old husks and produce fresh shoots and leaves. Burning alive was reserved for victims associated with purification and cosmic renewal. These sacrifices usually involved throwing victims into massive bonfires or tying them to stakes. To be slowly roasted over flames, prolonged suffering was believed to be especially pleasing to the fire deity. Festivals of the fire gods often coincided with the completion of major construction projects, or the consecration of new temples, events requiring powerful ritual acts to ensure divine approval and protection. The social and political functions of human sacrifice extended far beyond their religious significance, serving as a mechanism of social control, political integration, and imperial legitimation. The spectacular nature of major ceremonies demonstrated the power of the state and the gods it served, inspiring awe and fear in both subjects and potential enemies. Foreign dignitaries invited to witness these events returned to their lands, with vivid accounts of Aztec might and divine patronage, which often prompted them to submit rather than resist imperial expansion. Capturing enemies for sacrifice served as a critical motive for Aztec warfare, transforming military campaigns from mere expeditions of conquest into sacred crusades serving both political and religious goals. Warriors competed for the honor of capturing prestigious victims, with successful captors receiving social advancement and material rewards, incentivizing further military service. The most skilled warriors could achieve noble status through their battlefield accomplishments, creating an element of meritocracy in an otherwise hereditary social hierarchy. The ritual consumption of victims' flesh served as a form of communion between the human and divine worlds, and also fulfilled practical nutritional functions in a society lacking large domestic animals. The bodies of sacrificed warriors were usually distributed among the captor's family and neighbors, who prepared the flesh in exquisite stews seasoned with chili peppers and other spices. This ritual cannibalism was understood as a way of absorbing the spiritual power of brave enemies, while simultaneously honoring their courage through ceremonial consumption. The training of priests who conducted these complex rituals required years of intensive education in specialized temple schools that preserved the detailed knowledge necessary for the correct execution of rites. Young men selected for the priesthood underwent rigorous physical and mental training, including long fasts, sleep deprivation, and painful bloodletting rituals demonstrating their devotion to divine service. They learned to read pictographic codices with ritual instructions, memorized complex songs and prayers, and mastered precise techniques for various forms of sacrifice. The priesthood maintained a strict hierarchy reflecting both spiritual authority and administrative responsibility within complex religious institutions. High-ranking priests, known as tlamacosqui, or those who give something, oversaw major temple complexes and conducted essential ceremonies. These individuals possessed encyclopedic knowledge of ritual procedures, astronomical calculations, and mythological traditions, allowing them to serve as intermediaries between the human and divine worlds. The accession of Moctezuma Xoyotzin to the throne of Tenochtitlan in 1502 marked the beginning of the most majestic and, ultimately, tragic period in Aztec history. At approximately 35 years of age, Moctezuma inherited an empire stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean, encompassing diverse peoples, climates, and resources that brought the Triple Alliance unprecedented wealth. Unlike his predecessors who built reputations on military conquests, Moctezuma focused his reign on consolidating power through administrative complexity, architectural grandeur, and systematic tribute extraction. The new Huitlatoni possessed impeccable credentials for his high post, having served as the high priest of Huitzilopochtli before his election by the Council of Nobles. His religious training provided him with comprehensive knowledge of the ritual calendar and theological principles, while his noble birth directly linked him to the royal line. Tracing back to the legendary rulers of ancient Tolan, Moctezuma's education in the Colmecac emphasized the intellectual and ceremonial aspects of leadership rather than a purely military focus, reflecting the empire's evolution from a confederation of warriors into a complex administrative state. Moctezuma's administrative reforms transformed the imperial government from a relatively loose collection of tributary relationships into a centralized bureaucracy. The emperor established new government departments responsible for tribute collection, military organization, judicial proceedings, and religious ceremonies. Each department was staffed by professional administrators from the nobility. The tribute collection system reached its most sophisticated form. Detailed records were kept of the obligations and payment schedules of each community. Imperial scribes created complex codices documenting the goods required from each province, their quantities, and delivery dates to Tenochtitlan's warehouses. These documents represented masterpieces of pictographic art and practical organization with colorful illustrations of the products flowing into the capital. The wealth generated by this system allowed Moctezuma to maintain a court of unprecedented luxury. The imperial palace expanded to include numerous buildings for thousands of servants, administrators, and guards. The complex included private chambers, audience halls, artisan workshops, and gardens with exotic plants and animals. The emperor's daily routine reflected the ceremonial nature of power. Moctezuma began the day with purification rites, bathing in sacred water, burning copal incense, and offering his own blood to the gods through piercings of the tongue and ears with obsidian blades. These private rites were followed by public appearances to receive governors' reports, resolve legal cases, and conduct religious ceremonies. The emperor's meals embodied the empire's abundance. Palace kitchens daily prepared hundreds of dishes from ingredients brought from every corner of the country. Fresh fish was delivered daily from the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific Ocean by relay runners covering hundreds of kilometers in less than 2 days. Tropical fruits were preserved in honey, and wild birds were kept alive in palace aviaries. The tribute system relied on a network of provincial administrators and local rulers. Coastal provinces supplied vast quantities of cotton, cacao, feathers, and precious stones. Cotton went toward fine textiles, serving as currency and gifts, while cacao provided the base for the nobility's chocolate drinks. The bright feathers of quetzals and parrots were turned into headdresses, and jade and amber into the emperor's jewelry. Highland provinces supplied different tributes: obsidian for weapons, timber for construction, and fuel for fires in temples and palaces. Agricultural regions supplied maize, beans, and chili peppers to feed the urban population, while communities at salt deposits ensured this vital product for food preservation and rituals. Western provinces controlled by the Tarascan peoples remained largely independent of tribute obligations to the Aztecs, successfully resisting imperial expansion thanks to their superior metallurgical technologies and disciplined military organization. However, significant trade relations developed in the border regions between the two empires, resulting in copper, silver, and bronze items flowing into Aztec territories in exchange for tropical products and luxury goods, controlled by the merchants of Tenochtitlan. These commercial relations provided both empires with access to resources unavailable in their own territories while maintaining a political independence that prevented costly military conflicts. The northern borders of the empire stretched to semi-arid regions inhabited by Chichimeca peoples, whose nomadic lifestyle and warrior culture resembled that of the Mexica's own ancestors. These communities paid tribute in the form of animal skins, medicinal plants, and precious minerals extracted from mountain deposits, while simultaneously serving as buffer zones protecting the empire's sedentary population from raids by more distant nomadic groups. The inclusion of Chichimeca warriors into imperial armies provided the Aztecs with scouts and light infantry whose desert survival skills complemented the more traditional military capabilities of Highland troops. The construction projects undertaken during the reign of Moctezuma transformed Tenochtitlan into one of the world's most magnificent cities, with architectural achievements rivaling contemporaneous European capitals, while embodying unique Mesoamerican design principles and construction technologies. The expansion of the Templo Mayor, the Great Pyramid dominating the city's ceremonial center, required the labor of thousands of workers and the transportation of vast quantities of stone, timber, and decorative materials from across the empire. The completed temple complex rose approximately 60 meters above the level of the surrounding square. Its twin sanctuaries were dedicated to Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, representing the fundamental duality of Aztec religious thought. The pyramid's exterior was covered with carved stone panels depicting mythological scenes, historical events, and astronomical observations communicating imperial ideology to the diverse population. Visiting the capital for religious festivals and tribute offerings, the shrines at the summit housed exquisite sculptures of patron deities, crafted from precious materials including gold, jade, and tropical bird feathers, demonstrating the empire's wealth and artistic sophistication. The ceremonial square surrounding the Templo Mayor was expanded to accommodate the vast crowds gathering for major religious festivals. New buildings were constructed for priests, administrators, and visiting dignitaries participating in these solemn ceremonies. The stone paving of the square was laid in geometric patterns, reflecting astronomical correspondences and cosmological principles, while drainage canals beneath the surface prevented flooding during the rainy season and maintained the ritual purity of the sacred space. The palace complex adjacent to the ceremonial center underwent a similar expansion. During Moctezuma's reign, new buildings were added for the growing imperial bureaucracy and specialized artisans producing luxury goods for the court's needs. The emperor's private residence included numerous courtyards planted with flowers and shade trees, reflecting pools providing coolness in hot weather, and aviaries housing exotic birds from across the empire as symbols of Moctezuma's dominion over various habitats. Hundreds of skilled craftsmen labored in palace workshops, creating magnificent objects that adorned the imperial court and served as diplomatic gifts for foreign rulers. Feather workers crafted intricate headdresses using tropical bird plumage, ranged in complex patterns requiring years of training to master. Simultaneously, goldsmiths created jewelry and decorative objects using filigree techniques and realistic sculptural forms. Lapidaries carved ornaments and ritual objects from jade, obsidian, and other precious stones, whose symbolic meaning was clear to educated members of the nobility, but remained mysterious to ordinary observers. The expansion of Tenochtitlan's urban infrastructure during this period included the construction of new causeways, improving communication between the island capital and the mainland, additional aqueducts supplying fresh water to the growing population, and expanded canal systems facilitating the movement of goods throughout the city. The engineering challenges associated with these projects required innovative solutions demonstrating the advanced technical capabilities of Aztec architects and builders. The causeway connecting Tenochtitlan to Tacubaya was rebuilt with wider roads and more advanced bridge systems that could accommodate increased traffic flow, while maintaining the defensive capabilities necessary to protect the capital from potential enemies. New bridges included mechanical systems allowing for sections to be quickly raised or lowered, ensuring the passage of large canoes and providing the ability to cut off land access to the city in emergencies. The aqueduct system supplying Tenochtitlan with fresh water was expanded through the construction of additional canals originating from springs in the hills surrounding the valley, while complex distribution networks delivered water to neighborhoods throughout the city. The design of these water systems required precise calculations of elevation, flow rate, and pressure drops, demonstrating the mathematical abilities of Aztec architects and the organizational skills of administrators coordinating these massive construction projects. Omens and prophecies beginning to appear in the final years of Moctezuma's reign created an atmosphere of anxiety and supernatural dread that deeply influenced the empire's reaction to the arrival of the Spanish conquistadors. The first of these portents appeared around 1510, when a comet with a long brilliant tail became visible in the pre-dawn sky for several months. Aztec astronomers, who kept detailed records of celestial phenomena and their terrestrial correlations, interpreted this phenomenon as a warning of an impending catastrophe that would affect the entire empire. The appearance of the comet was followed by a series of additional omens reinforcing fears of approaching disaster. A mysterious fire destroyed the temple of Huitzilopochtli without any visible cause, burning so intensely that water seemed only to feed the flames rather than extinguish them. The temple of Xiuhticuhtli, the fire god, was struck by lightning under a clear sky, an event interpreted as divine displeasure with imperial policy or religious practices. Strange voices were heard at night, lamenting the fate of Tenochtitlan and the end of Aztec dominion over Mesoamerica. The most disturbing of these supernatural manifestations included the appearance of ghostly figures and monstrous creatures witnessed by reliable observers across the empire. Fishermen reported seeing a woman walking on the surface of Lake Texcoco, weeping and lamenting the fate awaiting her children. Hunters encountered two-headed men in the forests around the capital, and farmers found birds and animals with human faces speaking prophecies of doom. Before vanishing into thin air, Moctezuma's reaction to these omens reflected both his deep religious convictions and an understanding of their potential political consequences. The emperor consulted with the most learned priests and astronomers of his realm, seeking interpretations that could suggest appropriate ritual actions to appease the divine wrath that had generated these warnings. Additional human sacrifices were conducted in temples across the empire, while special ceremonies were organized in honor of deities possessing the power to avert predicted catastrophes. The emperor also dispatched messengers to distant oracles and shamans reputed to possess supernatural insight, seeking other perspectives on the omen's meaning and possible ways to prevent their fulfillment. These consultations generated contradictory interpretations, ranging from warnings of natural cataclysms, such as earthquakes or volcanic eruptions, to prophecies of a foreign invasion and the overthrow of the imperial dynasty. The most significant of these prophetic traditions concerned the expected return of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent deity, who ruled in a golden age of peace and prosperity. Before sailing across the eastern sea with a promise to return in the year Zacatl read, according to the calculations of Aztec astronomers, the year 1519 of the European calendar corresponded to the year Zacatl in the Indian chronological system, creating expectations of the god's imminent return, and that his arrival would bring fundamental changes to the existing order. The prophecies surrounding Quetzalcoatl's return described the deity as a bearded light-skinned man, arriving from the east accompanied by followers and with gifts confirming his divine nature. These traditions, preserved for centuries in temple schools, created a theological framework that deeply influenced Aztec interpretations of the Spanish arrival, and complicated the empire's reaction to the aggressive actions of the conquistadors. The Spanish expedition, destined to forever change the course of Mesoamerican history, began not with grand imperial designs, but with the pragmatic ambitions of Cuban colonists, seeking new sources of wealth and labor among the indigenous population. Governor Diego Velázquez de Cuellar dispatched to previous expeditions to explore the Mexican coast, first under the command of Francisco Hernández de Córdoba in 1517, and then under Juan de Grijalva in 1518. Both ventures returned with tantalizing reports of advanced civilizations, an abundance of gold, and densely populated cities, promising opportunities for conquest and enrichment far exceeding anything the Spanish had encountered in the Caribbean islands. Hern Cortes, a minor hidalgo from Extremadura who had spent 15 years in the Caribbean establishing himself as a successful encomendero and municipal official, possessed the combination of ambition, administrative experience, and political connections necessary to organize the most extensive expedition yet against mainland Mexico. Born around 1485 in Medellín, Cortes briefly studied law at the University of Salamanca before dropping out to seek his fortune in the New World. The years spent in Hispaniola and Cuba taught him the intricacies of colonial administration, the importance of maintaining good relations with indigenous allies, and methods for extracting maximum wealth from conquered territories. The expedition that left Cuba in February 1519 consisted of 11 ships, carrying about 630 Spanish soldiers, sailors, and adventurers, as well as several hundred auxiliary forces from among the indigenous inhabitants of the Caribbean islands who served as interpreters, guides, and laborers. The Spanish contingent included 32 crossbowmen, 13 musketeers armed with primitive firearms, 16 cavalrymen with their horses, and several hundred soldiers armed with steel swords, pikes, and shields. The expedition also possessed 14 small cannons, including falconets and culverins, which could fire stone or iron balls, producing a devastating effect on indigenous warriors unaccustomed to gunpowder weapons. The technological advantages of the Spanish forces went beyond the superiority of metallurgy and gunpowder weapons, including innovations in military organization, logistics, and maritime transport reflecting centuries of European experience in warfare and exploration. The steel weapons of the Spanish soldiers retained their sharpness much longer than obsidian tools, and could pierce the cotton armor of Mesoamerican warriors, while metal helmets and breastplates provided protection from arrows and clubs that would be lethal to an opponent without armor. Horses, unknown in America before the arrival of Europeans, caused psychological shock among indigenous peoples, providing Spanish cavalry with unprecedented mobility and tactical flexibility. The first significant meeting of the expedition with the indigenous population of Mexico occurred on the coast of Yucatan, where Mayan communities maintained their independence. Despite the proximity of Spanish settlements in the Caribbean, the Mayan peoples of this region created advanced urban centers, monumental architecture, and writing systems that rivaled the achievements of central Mexico. Although the experience of previous Spanish expeditions taught them to treat European guests with suspicion and hostility, the initial contacts between Cortes' expedition and Mayan communities followed patterns established during past explorations. Indian leaders tried to assess the intentions of the Europeans, while Spanish commanders sought information about regional politics, resources, and potential allies or enemies. The Mayan caciques who met with Spanish representatives possessed detailed knowledge of the powerful empire controlling the Mexican highlands, as for generations they had maintained trade relations with Aztec merchants and received regular visits from Pachateca expeditions exchanging tropical products for highland craft items. These early encounters provided courts with vital intelligence about the political situation in central Mexico, including information about the tribute relationships binding subject peoples to the Triple Alliance, and the resentment many communities harbored toward Aztec rule. Informants described the magnificent capital of Tenochtitlan with its floating gardens and massive temples, the wealth flowing into the city from all over Mesoamerica, and the military power ensuring imperial authority over a diverse population. Most importantly, they revealed the existence of indigenous groups along the Mexican coast who resisted Aztec conquest and might welcome Spanish support against their traditional enemies. The arrival of the expedition at the island of Cozumel provided courts with one of his most valuable assets, in the person of Guillermo de Aguilar, a Spanish priest shipwrecked on the Yucatan coast 8 years prior, who had learned the Mayan language during his time in captivity. Aguilar's linguistic abilities and knowledge of the culture proved invaluable for subsequent negotiations with Indian leaders. His information about Mayan political organization and religious practices helped Spanish commanders develop strategies to exploit divisions among potential enemies and allies. The Spanish landing at the mouth of the Grijalva River brought the expedition into contact with the Chontal people of Tabasco, who controlled important trade routes between the Gulf Coast and the highland regions of central Mexico. Chontal communities grew wealthy through their role as intermediaries in long-distance trade, charging tolls on merchant expeditions and providing services for transporting goods between different ecological zones. Their strategic position and economic importance allowed them to maintain independence from both the Mayan kingdoms to the east and the Aztec Empire to the west. The Battle of Centla, occurring in March 1519, demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of Spanish military technology against Indian forces, and established patterns of warfare that would characterize the conquest period. The Chontal warriors opposing the Spanish landing used dense formations, shouting battle cries and brandishing obsidian-bladed weapons decorated with bright feathers and precious stones. Their cotton armor, wooden shields, and quilted tunics provided adequate protection against Indian weapons, but proved powerless against steel Spanish swords and crossbow bolts. The Spanish cavalry charge that broke the Mayan battle line caused panic among warriors who had never encountered horses and initially believed the horse and rider represented a single supernatural being. The thunderous noise of Spanish cannons combined with acrid gunpowder smoke and the cries of wounded people and animals turned the battlefield into a scene of chaos and terror. Breaking traditional Mayan military discipline, the Spanish victory was complete and decisive. Hundreds of casualties among the indigenous population with minimal European losses. The aftermath of the battle brought courts one of his main advantages in the person of Malintzin, known to the Spanish as Doa Marina or La Malinche, who served as an interpreter, cultural advisor, and strategic partner throughout the conquest campaign. Malintzin was among 20 young women presented to the Spaniards as tribute by the defeated Chontal leaders, but her linguistic abilities and noble birth quickly distinguished her from the other captives. Born into the Nahuatl-speaking nobility of central Mexico, she had been sold into slavery as a child and learned the Mayan language during years of captivity in Tabasco, making her a unique link between Spanish and Indian cultures. Malinche's role went far beyond mere translation, as she possessed deep knowledge of Mesoamerican political systems, religious practices, and social hierarchies, allowing her to advise Spanish commanders on proper protocols for diplomatic negotiations and military operations. Her understanding of indigenous concepts of power, tribute relationships, and alliance systems proved crucial to Spanish efforts to exploit divisions among potential opponents and recruit allies for the campaign. The complex relationship that developed between Melanesian and courts included personal, political, and strategic aspects that deeply influenced the course of interactions between the Spanish and the indigenous population during the conquest period. The arrival of the Spanish expedition in the Teutonic city of Sempoala in June 1519 provided courts with his first major allies and vital information about the Aztec imperial administration. Teutonic peoples controlled the fertile coastal plains, a region conquered by the Triple Alliance during the reign of Axayacatl, and burdened with heavy tributes including cotton cloths, tropical products, and human sacrifices for rights. The Teutonic cacique, who received the Spanish expedition, expressed bitter resentment against Aztec rule, and a readiness to support any force capable of challenging imperial power. Teutonic complaints about the Aztec administration provided courts with detailed information about the tribute system sustaining the empire and the mechanisms for enforcing authority. In distant provinces, Teutonic leaders described the regular arrival of tribute collectors accompanied by armed guards, demanding goods according to schedules recorded in pictographic records. Communities failing to meet obligations faced military intervention, executions of leaders, and punitive raids. The alliance between the Spaniards and the Teutonic Confederation was officially formalized by ceremonies combining European and Indian diplomatic traditions. The Teutonics provided the Spaniards with thousands of warriors, detailed maps of routes into the highland regions, and logistical support. The most dramatic demonstration of this alliance occurred when courts ordered the Teutonics to arrest the Aztec tribute collectors who arrived in Sempoala. This unprecedented act of defiance caused a shock in the region, demonstrating the Spaniards' readiness to support resistance to the Aztecs. The arrested officials were later released, with a message for Moctezuma about the Spaniards' military power. But the incident had already established courts as a potential alternative to imperial authority. The Spaniards' decision to found Villa Rica de la Veracruz as a permanent settlement reflected Cortes' understanding of Spanish legal traditions and his determination to legitimize the expedition. The founding of the municipality provided a legal basis for the Spanish presence, creating institutions capable of issuing orders and conducting negotiations. The city council elected Cortes as Captain General and Chief Justice, formally vesting him with the powers necessary to conduct operations, without regard for Governor Velázquez's instructions. The destruction of the Spanish ships eliminated any possibility of retreat, forcing all members of the expedition to fully commit themselves to the conquest. This gesture, often mistakenly called burning the ships, actually involved the careful salvage of useful materials: iron, sails, ropes, for subsequent use on land. The elimination of the fleet also prevented potential deserters from returning to Cuba with reports. The Spanish march to Tenochtitlan began in August 1519, with a combined force of approximately 400 Spanish soldiers and several thousand Teutonic warriors. The logistical difficulties of crossing complex terrain required coordination with allies, who knew water sources and hazards. Cortes' route lay through the territory of the Tlaxcalan Confederation, an alliance of 4 city-states that had maintained independence from the Aztecs. The Tlaxcalans controlled important routes and served as a buffer zone. Initial encounters between the Spaniards and Tlaxcalans demonstrated the complex calculations of Indian leaders. Initially, the Tlaxcalans considered the Spaniards allies of the Aztecs and attacked to test their strength. Violent battles revealed both the effectiveness of Spanish weapons and the courage of Indian warriors. The Spanish victory at the Battle of Texcoco in September 1519 resulted from a combination of European technologies and Teutonic auxiliary forces. Following the defeat, debates flared within the Tlaxcala leadership. Proponents of resistance were in the minority, due to the obvious superiority of Spanish weapons over traditional tactics. The senior representatives of the nobility, who opposed the war with the Spaniards, increased their influence in the Confederation councils, and began negotiations that transformed the Tlaxcalans from enemies into the most important Indian allies in this campaign. The Spanish entry into the city of Tlaxcala in September 1519 was a decisive turning point in the conquest campaign, as courts gained access to the largest Indian military force in central Mexico, while the Tlaxcalans gained European allies capable of challenging Aztec dominance. Negotiations formalizing this alliance required careful adherence to diplomatic protocols and ceremonial requirements accepted in Indian politics. Spanish commanders participated in complex rituals confirming their status as honored guests and potential military partners. The Tlaxcalan Confederation provided the Spanish expedition with about 6,000 warriors, detailed intelligence on Aztec military capabilities and political vulnerabilities, as well as logistical support including food, weapons, and transport services for the march on Tenochtitlan. More importantly, the alliance with Tlaxcala demonstrated to other Indian communities that Spanish military technologies could provide effective protection against Aztec revenge, offering an opportunity to overthrow the tributary dependence that enriched the Triple Alliance at the expense of subject peoples. The massacre perpetrated by the Spaniards in Cholula in October 1519 exposed the brutal methods European commanders were willing to use against Indian communities suspected of betrayal or resistance. Cholula was one of the most important religious centers in Mesoamerica, with massive temple complexes attracting pilgrims from across the region, and a population of skilled artisans producing luxury goods. 4 noble houses throughout central Mexico. The city's rulers submitted to Spanish authority and provided the expedition with supplies, but courts received a warning from Tlaxcalan allies and Malintzin that Cholula's leaders were planning an ambush in coordination with Aztec forces. The preemptive attack ordered by courts resulted in the deaths of thousands of Cholulan civilians and the destruction of significant parts of the city, including several important temples that were demolished to provide materials for building a Catholic church on the site of the main pyramid. This massacre served as a demonstration of Spanish military capabilities and a warning to other Indian communities of the consequences of resistance or betrayal. The psychological effect of the Cholula massacre spread far beyond the vicinity, as reports of Spanish brutality circulated throughout central Mexico and influenced subsequent Indian reactions to European demands and alliance proposals. News of the Spanish advance to Tenochtitlan reached Moctezuma through extensive intelligence networks connecting the imperial capital with distant provinces and allied city-states. The emperor's initial reaction reflected a complex mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and religious reflection characteristic of the Aztec elite upon reports of European arrival and actions. The technological superiority demonstrated by Spanish forces, combined with their alliance with Indian enemies of the empire, indicated that these strangers posed a significant threat to imperial authority and territorial integrity. The gifts sent by Moctezuma to the Spanish expedition included magnificent examples of Aztec craftsmanship designed to demonstrate imperial wealth and artistic sophistication, potentially satisfying the Europeans' thirst for precious materials. The treasures included exquisite feather headdresses, gold jewelry with images of Aztec deities, jade items, and cotton cloths with fine patterns requiring many years of skilled labor. These diplomatic offerings reflected traditional Mesoamerican practice of exchanging gifts between rulers in an attempt to establish peaceful relations, capable of preventing military conflict. The way the Spaniards received these gifts revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of Indian political systems and diplomatic protocols, which complicated subsequent negotiations between European and Aztec representatives. Spanish commanders interpreted the valuable offerings as evidence of vast riches awaiting conquest, rather than as diplomatic gestures requiring reciprocal respect and friendship. The Europeans' focus on precious metals in the Aztec gifts, combined with disregard for the artistic and religious significance of the featherwork and textiles, demonstrated a cultural misunderstanding that made a constructive diplomatic solution increasingly unlikely. The emperor's decision to receive the Spanish expedition in Tenochtitlan reflected complex calculations of military capabilities, religious obligations, and political necessity that remain a subject of historical debate. Moctezuma I possessed detailed information about Spanish military technologies and Indian alliance systems, while simultaneously facing the theological implications of prophecies regarding Quetzalcoatl's return and the potential divine nature of the European guests. The emperor's religious training and his ceremonial duties required him to consider supernatural explanations for unprecedented events, while his political experience required a realistic assessment of military threats and diplomatic opportunities. The entry of the Spaniards into Tenochtitlan on November 8, 1519, was one of the most extraordinary encounters in human history. As representatives of two completely different civilizational traditions, they met in the magnificent capital of the most powerful empire in Mesoamerica. Spanish soldiers, having crossed the causeway from the mainland into the island city, found themselves surrounded by architectural wonders, engineering achievements, and artistic creations that challenged European ideas about the capabilities of indigenous peoples, demonstrating the wealth and sophistication of Aztec civilization. The first meeting of courts and Moctezuma I occurred according to Indian ceremonial protocols, emphasizing the divine nature of power and the sacred obligations governing the interaction of political leaders. The emperor, carried on a golden litter under a canopy of precious feathers, was dressed in garments of the finest Mesoamerican materials, and his retinue performed rituals confirming his status as the earthly representative of the gods. The Spanish captain general, dressed in his best European clothes and accompanied by his most trusted officers, attempted to reciprocate these ceremonial gestures, while maintaining the dignity befitting his position as leader of a sovereign expedition. The housing of the Spaniards in the palace of Axayacatl provided European guests with unprecedented access to the internal workings of the Aztec imperial administration, while simultaneously placing them in a potentially vulnerable position. In the heart of enemy territory, the palace complex included living quarters for Spanish soldiers, stables for horses, and warehouses for equipment and supplies, while providing opportunities for observation and intelligence gathering on Aztec military capabilities, their political organization, and economic resources. The weeks following the Spaniards' arrival in Tenochtitlan were marked by a complex series of negotiations, ceremonies, and misunderstandings reflecting the fundamental incompatibility of European and Indian concepts of political power, religious duty, and territorial sovereignty. Spanish demands for tribute payments, conversion to the faith, and political subordination clashed with Aztec expectations of diplomatic reciprocity, cultural respect, and recognition of imperial authority. The presence of Spanish soldiers in the ceremonial center of the empire created unprecedented tension, challenging traditional protocols and generating questions about the proper reaction to a foreign military force. The arrest of Moctezuma I by Spanish forces in November 1519 represented a desperate attempt by courts to maintain control over an increasingly dangerous situation. By manipulating Indian political institutions and religious beliefs, the capture of the emperor violated the foundational principles of Aztec political theory, demonstrating the Spaniards' readiness to use extreme measures to achieve their goals. The imprisonment of the emperor caused a constitutional crisis in the imperial government, undermining the religious foundations of Aztec authority and territorial control. The massacre at the Great Temple during the Festival of Texcoco in May 1520 marked the final break in Spanish-Aztec relations and the beginning of the violent confrontation that determined the fate of the empire. Pedro de Alvarado, left in command of Tenochtitlan while courts dealt with a rival Spanish expedition on the coast, ordered his soldiers to attack Aztec nobles participating in traditional religious ceremonies. At the main temple complex, the Spanish assault claimed the lives of hundreds of unarmed participants, including many of the empire's most important political and religious leaders, desecrating the sacred spaces that formed the spiritual center of Aztec civilization. The Indian uprising following the temple massacre reflected the accumulated resentment and religious indignation that had been growing since the Spaniards' arrival in the capital. Aztec warriors, coordinated by surviving members of the Imperial Council, launched coordinated attacks on Spanish positions, cutting the causeways connecting the island city with the mainland. The siege of Spanish positions in the Palace of Texcoco demonstrated the Indians' capacity for sustained military operations, exposing the vulnerability of European forces deprived of mobility and logistical advantages. The death of Moctezuma I during the uprising remains one of the most controversial events of the conquest period. Spanish and Indian sources provide conflicting accounts of the circumstances and those responsible for the emperor's death. Spanish chronicles claimed that the emperor was killed by stones thrown by his own subjects when he attempted to address the crowd and restore order. Indian sources, however, suggested that Spanish soldiers killed their captive when his usefulness as a puppet ruler was exhausted. The death of the emperor eliminated any possibility of a peaceful settlement, creating a succession crisis that further destabilized imperial authority during the military clash. The Night of Sorrows La Noche Triste, on June 30, 1520, witnessed the Spanish retreat from Tenochtitlan under the cover of darkness, as courts attempted to evacuate his forces, before the Aztec siege completely destroyed the Europeans' military potential. The Spanish column, burdened with treasures looted from imperial palaces and temples, attempted to cross the western causeway under constant attack from Aztec warriors in war canoes, who had anticipated the escape attempt. The retreat turned into a rout as Spanish soldiers, weighed down by gold and silver, drowned in the lake, while their Indian allies were crushed by superior enemy forces. The losses sustained during the Night of Sorrows reduced Spanish military power by more than half, while simultaneously destroying many Indian allies who provided crucial support for European operations in central Mexico. The survivors who reached safety in Tlaxcalan territory faced the daunting prospect of rebuilding their forces in opposition to an emboldened Aztec empire that had demonstrated its ability to defeat European military technologies. Through coordinated resistance and numerical superiority, the treasures that motivated the Spaniards to participate in the conquest now lay scattered at the bottom of the lake, while the Indian allies who provided intelligence and logistics began to doubt their commitment to a cause that seemed increasingly hopeless. The accession of Cuauhtémoc to the post of Huitlatoni in early 1521 marked a fundamental transformation in the philosophy of leadership and military strategy of the Aztecs during the final crisis of the empire. Unlike his predecessors who tried to satisfy Spanish demands through negotiations and compromises, Cuauhtémoc represented the militant faction of the imperial nobility advocating for total war against the European invaders and their Indian allies. Born around 1495, the new emperor was about 26 years old at the time he came to power, making him the youngest ruler in Aztec history and a leader whose entire adult experience was shaped by the crisis of foreign invasion and imperial collapse. Cuauhtémoc's election occurred through the traditional voting process in the Imperial Council, but the circumstances of his choice reflected the desperate military situation. A devastating smallpox epidemic that swept through central Mexico in 1520 and early 1521 claimed the lives of a huge number of Indians, including Cuauhtémoc, the successor to Moctezuma I, who ruled for only 80 days. The epidemic also destroyed many experienced administrators, military commanders, and religious leaders who usually ensured the continuity of power. The primary task of the new emperor was the reorganization of the armed forces. To more effectively withstand the Spanish threat, Cuauhtémoc possessed extensive combat experience from campaigns against Tlaxcala and other enemies of the Triple Alliance, and his youth and energy allowed him to endure the exhausting schedule of wartime planning, negotiations, and rituals. His rise to power coincided with the arrival of reinforcements from across the empire, as tributary communities responded to the call despite the chaos caused by diseases. The emperor's military strategy emphasized the advantages of Indian forces in the unique environment of the Valley of Mexico. in particular knowledge of the terrain and the ability to coordinate actions in a complex system of lakes and islands. Cuauhtémoc understood that Spanish cavalry and artillery were most effective in open terrain, while the limited space of urban combat and the aquatic environment of the lake system neutralized many of the Europeans' tactical advantages. The fortification of Tenochtitlan under Cuauhtémoc's leadership transformed the island capital into a fortress capable of withstanding a long siege. The emperor ordered the construction of additional defensive structures along the causeways, including stone barriers, earthworks, and hidden positions for archers and spear throwers. The canal system, originally intended for transport and drainage, was modified to create obstacles directing attackers into pre-prepared kill zones. The most significant changes concerned the systematic destruction of bridges on the causeways, creating gaps that could only be crossed by swimming or with the help of portable bridges. These breaches were covered by warriors with bows, atlatls, and slings. Defensive positions were provided with a large number of stones and arrows accumulated in the city. In the months preceding the siege, the emperor's diplomatic efforts focused on maintaining the loyalty of communities and cities whose support was necessary for survival. Cuauhtémoc dispatched messengers throughout Mesoamerica with appeals for help and warnings about the consequences of a Spanish victory for all indigenous peoples. These missions emphasized religious and cultural threats, especially the destruction of temples and sacred objects. The response to the appeals varied. Communities suffering from heavy tributes showed no enthusiasm in defending the empire, while traditional allies provided support despite the risks. The city-state of Texcoco experienced internal division. Part of the nobility advocated for resistance, others for reconciliation with the Spaniards. The epidemics accompanying the conquest created a demographic catastrophe that changed the balance of power. Smallpox, typhus, and other old-world diseases killed a huge number of people deprived of immunity. Mortality in some communities reached 50% and higher. This not only reduced the number of warriors, but also destroyed governing institutions. The epidemics affected the sides differently. The Spaniards had partial immunity, while Indian warriors continued to die en masse during the siege period. Diseases also paralyzed agriculture, causing famine that undermined the morale of the defenders. Cuauhtémoc's efforts to maintain combat effectiveness required innovative approaches to troop recruitment. The emperor expanded military societies to include youth and veterans, and also involved women in the defense supply of ammunition, care for the wounded, repair of fortifications. The collapse of social hierarchies allowed commoners to participate in planning and leadership, which was previously the prerogative of the nobility. The Spanish siege strategy developed by courts during preparations in Tlaxcala reflected the lessons of the Night of Sorrows. The commander understood that a direct assault on the fortifications of Tenochtitlan would lead to exorbitant losses and relied on utilizing technological advantages. The construction of brigantines became the most innovative aspect of preparation, as these shallow draft vessels allowed for control of the lake system. The ships were built in Tlaxcala from timber cut in the mountains and delivered by thousands of allies to the lake. The vessels combined European technologies with a design adapted to Lake Texcoco, operating where conventional ships would have run aground. Each brigantine was about 12 meters long and carried a crew of Spanish sailors and Indian rowers. The vessels were armed with cannons and falconets capable of firing on canoes and fortifications, while elevated decks served as platforms for crossbowmen and musketeers. The psychological effect of these floating fortresses was no less important. The defenders, who had never seen naval artillery, initially considered them supernatural. The alliance system supporting the siege became an example of successful cooperation. Tens of thousands of Indian warriors joined the Spaniards. The Tlaxcalan Confederation fielded about 50,000 fighters with their own weapons and commanders. Additional allies arrived from across central Mexico, including communities that had recently thrown off the Aztec yoke. The cities of Texcoco and Chalco provided thousands of warriors and canoes, which was critical for actions on the water. The participation of former members of the Triple Alliance demonstrated the collapse of imperial unity. The logistics of supplying an army, numbering more than 100,000 people, required unprecedented coordination. Allied forces set up camps along the perimeter of Lake Texcoco, where each contingent was responsible for its own sector of the siege lines and tactical tasks. Supply lines stretching to Tlaxcala and other Allied territories provided food, weapons, and replenishment of personnel for forces suffering losses during prolonged siege operations. The siege of Tenochtitlan began in earnest in May 1521, with coordinated attacks on the causeways connecting the island capital with the mainland. Spanish troops, with the support of their Indian allies, launched simultaneous assaults on the northern, western, and southern approaches to the city, while Brigantines established control over the lake waters that had previously provided security for Aztec defenders. The initial stages of the siege focused on capturing and holding positions along the causeways, which would allow the attackers to gradually advance toward the city center. Fighting along the causeways proved exceptionally brutal and costly for both sides, as limited space prevented the effective use of Spanish cavalry, while Aztec defenders could concentrate their projectile fire against vulnerable attacking forces. Stone barriers and earthworks constructed by Cuauhtémoc's engineers directed the Spanish advance into predetermined kill zones where crossbow bolts and arquebus bullets gave only limited advantage against Indian warriors fighting from prepared positions. The gaps created by destroyed bridges forced Spanish soldiers to expose themselves to attack when trying to overcome water obstacles under constant fire from hidden defenders. The Spanish capture of Xoloc, a fortified position controlling the southern causeway, provided the attackers with their first major tactical success, and demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated operations involving European technologies and Indian allies. The assault on this strategic position required a joint effort of Spanish infantry, artillery, and Indian warriors who overwhelmed the defenders through numerical superiority and firepower. The fall of Xoloc allowed Spanish forces to establish a permanent bridgehead on the southern causeway, cutting off one of the routes that Aztec troops used to replenish their defensive positions. The systematic destruction of Tenochtitlan's urban infrastructure became a central component of the Spanish siege strategy, as courts recognized that the city's complex architecture and engineering systems provided numerous advantages to the defenders. The Spanish commander ordered the demolition of buildings, temples, and other structures that could serve as defensive positions or provide cover for Aztec warriors, while simultaneously destroying the aqueducts and canal systems that supplied fresh water to the city's population. This scorched earth approach created significant difficulties for the civilian population, while reducing the tactical advantages that Indian forces derived from their deep knowledge of the urban landscape. The destruction of Aztec temples and religious monuments served both tactical and ideological purposes within the Spanish siege strategy, as these structures provided elevated positions for defenders and represented the spiritual foundation of Indian resistance. Spanish soldiers systematically demolished pyramidal temples throughout the city, using stone blocks to fill canals and create roads allowing for the movement of artillery and supplies. The burning by the Spaniards of codices and other written materials became one of the most devastating cultural losses of the conquest period, since these pictographic documents contain knowledge accumulated over centuries about Aztec history, religion, science, and governance. Spanish soldiers and their Indian allies destroyed thousands of bark paper books during their advance through the city, viewing these materials as tools of diabolical influence. The loss of these irreplaceable documents created gaps in historical knowledge that continue to limit modern understanding of pre-Columbian Mesoamerican civilization. The impact of the siege on the civilian population of Tenochtitlan caused humanitarian catastrophes that influenced the course of military operations and the final outcome of the campaign. The Spanish blockade of the city prevented the import of food from the mainland, and the destruction of chinampas and other agricultural sites within the city limits eliminated local food production. The combination of military actions and epidemic diseases created conditions of extreme hardship for civilians trapped in the besieged city without adequate supplies of food, water, or medical care. Cuauhtémoc's efforts to maintain civilian morale and military effectiveness despite deteriorating conditions demonstrated outstanding leadership qualities and personal courage, earning respect even from his Spanish enemies. The emperor continued to appear at public ceremonies and military planning meetings, despite the obvious danger, and participated directly in combat operations. His visible presence during the most difficult stages of the siege provided psychological support to the defenders. The emperor's decision to continue resistance despite offers of negotiated surrender reflected both personal convictions and a strategic calculation of the likely consequences of a Spanish victory. Cuauhtémoc understood from previous Spanish actions that submission would not necessarily protect the Indian population from violence, exploitation, or cultural destruction. The emperor's determination to fight to the end also reflected traditional Aztec concepts of honor and duty. The Spanish capture of Tlatelolco in early August 1521 marked the beginning of the final phase of the siege, as Aztec forces were pinned into an increasingly shrinking territory in the southern part of Tenochtitlan. The fall of the great trading center deprived the defenders of one of their last sources of supply. The psychological blow of losing Tlatelolco was immense, as this commercial hub had served for generations as a symbol of Aztec prosperity. The fighting in the final weeks of the siege reached a level of intensity and brutality that shocked even experienced Spanish veterans. Aztec warriors, facing imminent death or slavery, fought with desperate courage in hand-to-hand combat that often lasted 4 hours in individual buildings and courtyards. The capture of Cuauhtémoc on August 13, 1521, occurred during the emperor's attempt to flee the fallen city in a war canoe. Accompanied by his family and closest advisors, Spanish brigantines patrolling the lake intercepted the imperial group as they tried to reach the mainland, where loyal forces might have allowed for continued resistance from mountain strongholds. The capture of the emperor removed the last legitimate source of imperial authority. The Spanish treatment of Cuauhtémoc after his capture reflected a complex mixture of respect, suspicion, and pragmatic calculation. Courts initially treated the captive emperor with the courtesy befitting his royal status, but Spanish suspicions regarding hidden treasures and potential rebellion led to harsher treatment, culminating in the emperor's torture and execution. The systematic torture of Cuauhtémoc and other captured Aztec nobles became one of the most shameful episodes of the conquest period. Spanish soldiers attempted to force the captives to reveal the location of hidden treasures. The emperor and his companions had their feet burned with oil. These brutal interrogations yielded no significant additional wealth, demonstrating the Spaniards' readiness to apply extreme violence, even to the highest-ranking captives. The execution of Cuauhtémoc in 1525, during Cortes' expedition to Honduras, removed the last legitimate claimants to Aztec imperial authority. The emperor was hanged along with other Aztec nobles on charges of conspiring to rebel, although evidence of such a conspiracy remains questionable. Cuauhtémoc's death marked the final end of the Aztec Empire and the beginning of the colonial period that transformed Mesoamerican society over the next 3 centuries. The establishment of Spanish colonial administration required the creation of new institutions, such as the encomienda system, which gave colonists the right to collect tribute and use the labor of Indian communities in exchange for protection and religious instruction. In practice, this often resembled slavery and led to brutal exploitation. The transformation of Tenochtitlan into Mexico City began immediately after the Spanish conquest. Hearn courts recognized the strategic advantages of maintaining the former Aztec capital as the center of colonial administration. However, the massive destruction caused by the siege required massive reconstruction efforts that fundamentally changed the urban landscape, incorporating Spanish architectural styles into the structure of the pre-existing Aztec city. The establishment of the Viceroyalty of New Spain in 1535 formalized the administrative structure that would govern the former Aztec territories for the next 3 centuries. The Viceroy Antonio de Mendoza arrived in Mexico City with comprehensive instructions from the Spanish crown regarding the organization of the colonial government, the extraction of wealth from the Indian population, and the implementation of Catholic evangelization programs aimed at eradicating pre-Columbian religious practices. The Viceroy's palace was built on the site of Moctezuma I's former residence, symbolically asserting Spanish authority over the physical and political space that once housed Aztec imperial power. The Spanish colonial administration relied on many administrative innovations that had allowed the Aztec Empire to manage diverse populations over vast territories. The tribute collection systems developed by Aztec bureaucrats were adapted for the needs of the Spanish colony. Indian communities were required to supply specific quantities of goods and labor to colonial authorities according to schedules resembling pre-conquest obligations. The Calpulli system neighborhood organization was preserved, but modified to facilitate Spanish control. Indian leaders served as intermediaries between colonial administrators and communities, while losing most of their traditional autonomy and authority. The encomienda grants, distributing Indian communities among Spanish colonists, represented a fundamental transformation of the tribute relations, characteristic of the Aztec Empire. Unlike the Aztec system, which allowed conquered peoples to maintain their traditional rulers and cultural customs, provided imperial obligations were met, the encomienda system placed Indian communities under the direct control of Spanish encomenderos, who possessed vast power over the population entrusted to them. These colonial grants included the right to collect tribute, demand labor services, and oversee the religious instruction of the Indians, creating opportunities for exploitation that often exceeded the burdens imposed by the pre-conquest imperial administration. The survival of Nahuatl as a spoken language throughout central Mexico demonstrated the resilience of indigenous cultural traditions, despite the destructive consequences of conquest and colonization. Spanish colonial authorities initially encouraged the use of Nahuatl as a lingua franca for communication with various groups of the indigenous population, which led to the development of standardized writing systems, allowing for the creation of Christian texts, legal documents, and administrative records in the native language. Franciscan missionaries, such as Bernardino de Sahan, worked with indigenous scholars to create comprehensive dictionaries and grammars that preserved detailed knowledge of Nahuatl literature, historical traditions, and religious practices before the conquest. The preservation of Nahuatl-speaking communities throughout the colonial period allowed for the transmission of cultural knowledge that survived the destruction of pictographic codices and the suppression of traditional religious ceremonies. Indigenous families continued to pass down oral traditions that kept alive the memory of history, mythology, and social customs before the conquest, while simultaneously adapting these cultural elements to the requirements of Spanish colonial rule and Catholic religious practice. The language itself evolved, incorporating Spanish loanwords and grammatical structures while maintaining its primary character as the chief means of communication for millions of indigenous residents. Agricultural methods developed in the Aztec period continued to form the basis of food production throughout central Mexico. Although Spanish colonization brought new crops, animals, and farming methods that significantly altered traditional systems, the Chinampa farming method, which originated in the lakes around Tenochtitlan, remained in use throughout the colonial period, providing the growing population of Mexico City with fresh vegetables and flowers. Spanish colonists recognized the productivity advantages of Chinampas and incorporated these artificial islands into colonial agricultural systems. Although the introduction of European crops gradually changed traditional cultivation practices, the arrival of European domestic animals, especially cattle, horses, and pigs, created new opportunities for indigenous farmers while disrupting traditional systems, optimized for crop production rather than animal husbandry. Indigenous communities adapted their farming methods to these new animals, developing integrated systems that combine traditional crop cultivation with European-style livestock breeding. The application of iron tools and plows, introduced by Spanish colonists, increased agricultural productivity by reducing labor costs for field preparation and cultivation. Traditional craft techniques survived the period of conquest and continued to influence colonial production. Although Spanish demand for European-style goods and the introduction of new materials and tools significantly changed indigenous craft practices, indigenous masters retained their expertise in textile production, pottery, and metalworking, adapting their skills to produce goods that met the demands of the colonial market and Spanish aesthetic preferences. Featherworking traditions, which created some of the most impressive examples of Aztec art, continued in the early colonial period. Indigenous masters created exquisite religious decorations for Catholic churches and ceremonial garments for Spanish colonial officials. The Spanish colonial government established guilds that regulated craft production and controlled access to raw materials, creating new organizational structures that replaced the hereditary craft specialization of the pre-Columbian era. Indigenous masters were required to obtain licenses and follow Spanish rules regarding product quality, pricing, and distribution, while simultaneously competing with Spanish artisans, who had advantages in access to imported materials. Despite these difficulties, indigenous craft traditions persisted and evolved, incorporating European techniques and materials, while maintaining distinctive aesthetic characteristics. Religious syncretism became one of the most complex and enduring aspects of cultural adaptation, as the indigenous population developed innovative approaches to reconciling traditional spiritual practices with the requirements of Catholic orthodoxy. The Virgin of Guadalupe, whose appearance to the indigenous peasant Juan Diego in 1531 occurred at the site of a former temple dedicated to the Aztec goddess Tonantzin, became the most striking example of such religious fusion. The cult of the Virgin of Guadalupe incorporated indigenous symbolic elements, including the dark skin of the goddess, her association with flowers and natural fertility, and her appearance to an Indian rather than a Spaniard, while complying with Catholic theological requirements regarding divine revelation. Indigenous communities throughout central Mexico developed similar syncretic practices that preserved elements of spiritual traditions before the conquest. Within the framework of Catholic worship, traditional deities were reinterpreted as Christian saints with similar attributes, and indigenous ceremonies were modified to include Catholic rituals and symbols. The construction of Catholic churches on the sites of former Aztec temples created physical continuity that allowed the indigenous population to maintain a spiritual connection with sacred places. The preservation of indigenous religious practices required careful maneuvering between communities and Spanish authorities seeking to eradicate traditions they considered idolatrous. Indigenous religious leaders developed complex strategies for preserving traditions, including the creation of hidden shrines, the use of coded symbols in Christian art, and the development of dual religious systems operating simultaneously. These adaptive strategies allowed key elements of religious traditions before the conquest to survive. The rediscovery of Aztec archaeological sites began in the late colonial period, but accelerated significantly after Mexico gained independence, as scholars and officials sought to establish a national cultural identity, including pre-Columbian heritage. The accidental find of the Coatlicue statue in 1790, during construction work in Mexico City's main square, was the first major example of monumental Aztec sculpture to attract scholarly attention. Although colonial authorities initially ordered the statue to be buried again, for fear of its influence on indigenous religious practices, the Sunstone Aztec calendar, discovered during the same construction, attracted international attention and became one of the most recognizable symbols of pre-Columbian Mesoamerican achievement. Systematic archaeological research of Aztec monuments began in the 19th century, when Mexican scholars and international researchers developed scientific approaches to studying pre-Columbian civilizations. The work of scholars such as Antonio Garca Cubas and Francisco del Paso y Troncoso laid the methodological foundations for archaeological research and allowed for the creation of complete catalogues of Aztec artifacts and architectural remains. These early studies focus predominantly on monumental architecture and spectacular artifacts, although they also initiated the process of documenting the complex urban systems and engineering achievements characteristic of the Aztec capital. The excavations of the Templo Mayor, which began with limited research in the early 20th century and culminated in a large-scale archaeological project initiated in 1978, revolutionized the understanding of Aztec religious practices, their urban planning, and imperial administration. The discovery of the Coyolxauhqui stone in 1978 during utility work in downtown Mexico City prompted the Mexican government to authorize extensive excavations that revealed numerous construction phases of the Great Temple, as well as thousands of artifacts providing detailed information about Aztec ritual practices, trade relations, and artistic achievements. Excavations of the Templo Mayor uncovered evidence of complex offering ceremonies accompanying each phase of the temple's construction. Caches were found containing thousands of items, including jade jewelry, obsidian knives, corals, shells, and the remains of sacrifices from all over Mesoamerica. These archaeological discoveries confirmed many descriptions from Spanish colonial sources, and also revealed aspects of Aztec religious life not recorded in written documents. The project set new standards for urban archaeology, demonstrating the potential for obtaining detailed information about pre-Columbian civilizations through systematic scientific research. Ongoing archaeological research in Mexico City continues to reveal new information about the layout of the Aztec city, engineering systems, and daily life through excavations during construction work and specialized research initiatives. The discovery of additional temple structures, residential complexes, and specialized workshops has provided comprehensive information about the organization of the Aztec capital, and has also shown the extent to which modern Mexico City overlaps the remains of Tenochtitlan. Ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive methods allow researchers to map buried structures without conducting large-scale excavations, creating detailed plans of the pre-conquest city that serve as a basis for both scientific research and urban planning decisions. The influence of Aztec civilization on Mexican national identity became particularly prominent after the Mexican Revolution of 1910, when political leaders sought to create unifying cultural symbols capable of bridging regional and class divisions and distinguishing Mexican identity from European colonial heritage. The adoption of the Aztec symbol of the eagle and the snake as the central element of the Mexican flag was the most visible expression of this cultural nationalism. At the same time, state-sponsored artistic projects incorporated Aztec themes and motifs into the design of public buildings, monuments, and educational materials intended to promote national unity and cultural pride. The muralist movement, led by artists such as Diego Rivera, Jose Clemente Orozco, and David Alfaro Siqueiros, created powerful visual narratives depicting Aztec civilization as the foundation of the Mexican nation, while criticizing Spanish colonialism and its ongoing socio-economic impact. These monumental works of art, displayed in significant public buildings throughout Mexico, presented idealized versions of pre-Columbian life, emphasizing the achievements of indigenous peoples in agriculture, architecture, and social organization, while depicting the Spanish conquest as a traumatic rupture of natural cultural development. The muralists' work influenced the popular understanding of Mexican history and established artistic traditions that continue to shape the country's modern cultural expression. Educational reforms of the 20th century included comprehensive study of pre-Columbian civilizations in Mexican school curricula, ensuring that successive generations of students learn about Aztec achievements in mathematics, astronomy, engineering, and art. These educational initiatives were designed to counter negative stereotypes about indigenous peoples spread during the colonial period, and to promote recognition of Mesoamerica's complex cultural traditions. The inclusion of Nahuatl language instruction in some school systems reflected broader efforts to preserve and revitalize indigenous cultural traditions within modern Mexican identity. Modern indigenous rights movements throughout Mexico drew inspiration from Aztec political and cultural traditions, advocating for recognition of land rights, cultural autonomy, and political representation. Organizations such as the Zapatista Army of National Liberation explicitly refer to pre-Columbian political concepts and symbols in their struggle for self-determination, developing innovative approaches to communal governance that incorporate traditional decision-making processes into modern political frameworks. These movements have contributed to international discussions on indigenous rights and cultural preservation, demonstrating the continuing relevance of pre-Columbian political and social traditions. Global understanding of Mesoamerican achievements has been fundamentally transformed by archaeological research and scholarly analysis revealing the complexity of Aztec urban planning, agricultural systems, and administrative institutions. International recognition of Aztec success in mathematics, astronomy, and engineering has fostered deeper respect for indigenous intellectual traditions, challenging Eurocentric notions of technological and cultural development. Museums worldwide now display Aztec artifacts and offer educational programs highlighting the innovative nature of pre-Columbian civilizations and their contribution to humanity's cultural heritage. The influence of Aztec architectural and artistic traditions continues to be traced in modern Mexican and global design. Architects and artists incorporate pre-Columbian motifs, spatial concepts, and construction techniques into their buildings, sculptures, and decorative arts. Geometric patterns, symbolic imagery, and the monumental scale characteristic of Aztec art have inspired countless modern works, and have also influenced urban planning projects seeking to create public spaces reflecting indigenous cultural values and aesthetic principles. The legacy of the Aztec Empire extends far beyond its historical significance as a pre-Columbian political entity, encompassing ongoing influence on language, culture, agriculture, and national identity, proving the enduring power of indigenous traditions to adapt and survive. Despite centuries of colonialism and cultural suppression, millions of people in Mexico and Central America who continue to speak Nahuatl and related languages maintain a direct link to the empire's linguistic heritage, while agricultural technologies, craft traditions, and cultural customs originating in the pre-conquest period continue to shape daily life. In indigenous communities across the region, the scientific study of Aztec civilization has contributed to a broader understanding of complex societies, imperial governance, and cultural adaptation, which is reflected in contemporary discussions on governance, social organization, and sustainable resource management. The advanced agricultural systems of the Aztecs, in particular the Chinampa cultivation method, have attracted the attention of modern agricultural researchers, seeking sustainable approaches to food production in urban environments and complex ecological situations. Administrative innovations that allowed the Aztec Empire to manage diverse populations over vast territories provide valuable lessons for modern political scientists and administrators facing similar challenges in multicultural societies. The tragic destruction of Aztec civilization during the Spanish conquest represents one of the most dramatic examples of cultural clash and imperial expansion in history, while the survival and adaptation of indigenous traditions demonstrate the resilience of human communities in the face of crushing trials. The complex legacy of the Aztec Empire continues to influence modern Mexico and the world through its contributions to art, architecture, agriculture, and political thought, ensuring that this remarkable civilization remains a vital part of humanity's cultural heritage. Despite the catastrophic rupture caused by Spanish colonization, ongoing archaeological research of Aztec sites the preservation of indigenous languages, and the inclusion of pre-Columbian themes in modern art and politics prove that the legacy of Tenochtitlan and its empire continues to shape human society. More than 5 centuries after the final defeat of Cuauhtémoc,